Ludacris sat at the back of the classroom, staring at the board, his heart racing. The numbers on the chalkboard seemed to mock him, dancing and shifting in a way that made his mind spin. It wasn't just any math problem, it was a riddle that had stumped some of the brightest minds in the world. A problem that had been presented by none other than Professor William Lawrence, a Harvard professor known for his groundbreaking work in mathematics. The kind of genius that people in the academic world whispered about with reverence. Ludacris wasn't supposed to be here. This was supposed to be a room full of college students from prestigious institutions, not a 16-year-old high school student from a poor neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. But here he was, sitting in the same room, under the same fluorescent lights, surrounded by people who didn't look like him, who didn't come from his background. And they didn't know what to make of him. He had been invited to this special advanced math class after acing the regional math competition, but deep down, Ludacris knew he was an outsider. The whispers and stares were enough to make him question why he even belonged here. The truth was, he didn't have the right kind of academic pedigree. He didn't have the high-priced tutoring or the polished resume that the other students had. What he had was raw, unpolished talent, and a burning desire to prove to everyone, especially himself, that he was just as good as anyone in this room. The problem on the board was a monster. Professor Lawrence had posed it as the ultimate challenge. It was a problem so difficult, so convoluted, that he had claimed it was unsolvable, even for him. That was the word he used, unsolvable. Ludacris couldn't shake the feeling that those words were meant to challenge everyone in the room, to see who would rise to the occasion and who would crumble under the weight of it. The other students seemed defeated before they even tried. Some were scribbling aimlessly in their notebooks, others were staring blankly at the board, looking for some spark of inspiration that never seemed to come. The professor stood at the front, watching them, his expression a mixture of patience and silent judgment. It was clear he had no expectation of anyone solving this puzzle. The clock ticked on, and Ludacris could feel the pressure mounting. The classroom was eerily quiet, with only the sound of pencils tapping against paper and the occasional sigh breaking the silence. But Ludacris wasn't going to give up. He didn't care about the judgment or the doubts that lingered in the air. He had come here for one reason, to prove that he could solve this problem. To show that he wasn't just some kid from the streets who didn't belong in a room like this. No, he was going to show them what he could do. He leaned forward, his mind racing. His fingers hovered over his notebook, the equations swirling in his head like a storm. He didn't have the luxury of fancy textbooks or high-end computers like some of the other students in the class. He didn't have those resources, but what he did have was the raw instinct for math that he had honed over years of solving problems in his free time. Ludacris had always been different. He wasn't like the other kids in his neighborhood. While most of his friends were focused on getting by, finding their way through the struggles of life, Ludacris found solace in numbers. He had discovered his love for math early on, and even though he didn't have the support or resources to nurture it, he never stopped learning. It was his escape, his way of navigating a world that often felt stacked against him. His mind started to clear, and the equations on the board began to make sense in a way they hadn't before. He didn't know why, but there was something about this particular problem that felt familiar. It was as though it was speaking to him, as if there was something hidden within the numbers, something waiting to be discovered. He took a deep breath, his pen hovering over his notebook. He started scribbling furiously, the numbers and symbols coming together in ways he hadn't anticipated. The more he worked through the problem, the more pieces fell into place. It was like a puzzle that was slowly revealing itself, one piece at a time. The longer he worked, the more the other students began to notice. At first, they glanced over at him in confusion, as though wondering why he was so focused when the rest of them had already given up. But then, as they saw his pen moving rapidly across the page, their curiosity began to grow. Ludacris didn't care. He was in his zone now. His mind was consumed with the problem, and he could feel it, he was getting closer. He could sense the solution just beyond his reach, like a treasure buried deep underground. Professor Lawrence, who had been pacing at the front of the room, now stopped. His eyes flickered over to Ludacris, and for the first time, there was a trace of interest in his gaze. He wasn't sure what to make of this kid, who had been so quiet and unassuming at first, but now seemed to be making progress where others had failed. Ludacris didn't notice the professor's gaze. He was lost in the numbers, his world reduced to nothing but equations and formulas. His mind was sharp, and he could almost feel the solution take shape in front of him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ludacris put his pen down and looked at the problem on the board one last time. It was done. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. The room had fallen silent again, but this time it wasn't because of defeat, it was because Ludacris had done something no one expected. He had solved the problem. The one that Professor Lawrence had deemed unsolvable. Ludacris walked to the front of the class, his hands shaking as he picked up the chalk. His chalk scraped across the board as he wrote down his solution, his mind buzzing with adrenaline. He finished, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the murmurs began. Whispers of disbelief. The students couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had watched Ludacris struggle, seen him lost in thought for hours, and now he had cracked the code. Professor Lawrence slowly walked over to the board, his eyes scanning the solution. The room held its breath. He took a step back, his face unreadable. And then, he did something Ludacris had never expected, he smiled. Well, the professor said, his voice calm but filled with a surprising warmth. It seems you found the mistake. Ludacris could hardly believe what he was hearing. The great Professor Lawrence, the man who had said this problem was unsolvable, was admitting he was wrong. The rest of the class sat in stunned silence. They had all heard what the professor said, but none of them could understand what had just happened. Ludacris stood there, unsure of what to say. His heart was still racing, and his mind was struggling to keep up with the moment. But one thing was certain, he had just changed everything. And this was only the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ludacris had never been the kind of kid who thought he'd end up here. Sitting in the grand lecture hall at Harvard, under the harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by students who seemed to know more than he could even dream of. It felt like a world away from his childhood in the gritty streets of Chicago, where survival was more of a priority than anything resembling formal education. But his journey here didn't start with formulas or equations. It started on the worn-out sidewalks of his neighborhood, where math was just another part of the backdrop of daily life. Ludacris had grown up in Englewood, a neighborhood that was far from the ivy-clad walls of prestigious universities like Harvard. It was a neighborhood where most kids didn't make it out, where the struggles of everyday life could easily crush someone's dreams before they even had a chance to start. Ludacris's father, Derek, had worked at the local steel plant for as long as Ludacris could remember. The hours were long, the work was grueling, and it barely paid enough to keep the family afloat. But Derek was a proud man. He believed in hard work and the idea that every generation could do better than the one before. He had passed those values down to Ludacris, teaching him that success didn't come from luck or privilege, but from grit, determination, and relentless effort. But even though Derek worked tirelessly, there was always a sense of scarcity hanging in the air. There were always bills to pay, rent to cover, food to find. And there was never any room for anything extra. There was no money for tutors or extracurriculars, no time for fancy schools or summer camps. It was all about getting by, making it through another day. Ludacris's mother, Tamika, was the rock of their family. She had worked as a nurse's aide, a job that didn't offer much but provided a steady paycheck. Tamika had always pushed her children to be better, to aim higher, and she never let them forget that education was the key to changing their lives. The world may not give you much, but your mind is something no one can take from you, she would tell them, day in and day out. Ludacris never really understood what she meant until much later. For a long time, the classroom wasn't a place where he felt like he belonged. He was smart, sure, but that didn't seem to count for much when you didn't have the right clothes, the right connections, or the right background. In school, he was just another face in the crowd, trying to make it through another day. The teachers didn't seem to notice him, and the other kids didn't care. It wasn't until he found math that things started to change. Math was different for Ludacris. It didn't care about where he came from or what he didn't have. It didn't care if his shoes were scuffed or if his clothes were old. It was pure. It was about logic, about solving problems, about understanding the world in a way that no one could take from him. While other kids struggled to get through English or history, Ludacris found comfort in numbers. They made sense to him, in a way that words never could. By the time he was in middle school, Ludacris was already devouring math textbooks that were years ahead of his grade level. He had no formal training. He was teaching himself, borrowing books from the library, watching online videos on his family's slow internet connection. But his passion for math was undeniable. It was the one thing that made him feel like he could be more than just a kid from Englewood. It was the one thing that made him believe that he could escape the cycle of poverty and limitations that seemed to grip everyone around him. Despite his natural talent, Ludacris was still a kid in a broken system. His school didn't have the resources to help him truly develop his abilities. There were no advanced placement courses in math, no gifted programs. Most of his teachers didn't know what to do with a kid who could solve calculus problems while others were still struggling with fractions. They didn't have the time or the tools to nurture his potential. But there was one teacher who did notice him. Mrs. Jennings, his math teacher in high school, was a soft-spoken woman with glasses that always seemed to slide down her nose. She saw something in Ludacris that no one else had. She noticed how he would finish his work early and start solving problems from the next level of the curriculum, just for fun. She saw the hunger in his eyes, the spark that told her he wasn't just a kid passing time in class. One day after class, Mrs. Jennings pulled him aside. "Ludacris," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you have a gift. Don't waste it. You need to take this seriously." Her words struck him deeply, not just because they were kind, but because they were true. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone to believe in him, to see him not as a kid from a rough neighborhood, but as someone with potential, with the ability to do something great. That conversation with Mrs. Jennings was a turning point for Ludacris. From that moment on, he threw himself into his studies with a focus he hadn't known he was capable of. He would spend hours after school, sitting at the small kitchen table in his apartment, working through problems, solving equations, and dreaming of the day when he could prove himself to the world. Ludacris knew he didn't have the same opportunities as the kids in wealthier neighborhoods, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He studied math relentlessly, hoping to earn a scholarship that would give him the chance to go to a university like Harvard, the place where he could finally learn everything he needed to know to change his life, and the lives of those around him. But it wasn't just about proving something to himself. Ludacris had another motivation, his family. He knew his parents wanted better for him. They sacrificed everything to give him a chance, and he couldn't let that sacrifice go to waste. They were working hard every day just to keep food on the table, but Ludacris knew that in the long run, it was education that would get them out of the cycle of poverty. So, when the opportunity came for Ludacris to take part in the regional math competition, he jumped at the chance. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was his chance to show that he belonged in places like Harvard. To show that no matter where he came from, no matter what he had, or didn't have, he could be just as good as anyone else. And when he solved the impossible problem, when he stood in that Harvard classroom and presented his solution to a room full of skeptical students and professors, Ludacris realized something. It wasn't just about proving his worth to them. It was about proving his worth to himself. This wasn't just about math anymore. It was about his place in the world. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The room had erupted with whispers, and Ludacris had barely registered the stares and murmurs. His solution to the impossible equation was still on the board, but his mind was already miles away, processing the gravity of what had just happened. Professor Lawrence had acknowledged him. Harvard's finest academic mind had admitted that Ludacris had solved what was once considered unsolvable. But the whispers weren't all positive. He could feel the unease in the air, the tension in the room thickening like smoke. Some of the students looked at him with awe, while others appeared skeptical. Ludacris had spent most of his life being underestimated, but this was different. These students weren't just any peers, they were the future of academia. They were supposed to be his equals. Instead, some of them looked at him like he didn't belong in the same space as them. As the class ended, the other students slowly filed out of the room. Some shot him quick glances, some didn't look at him at all. Ludacris packed his things, his heart still racing. Was he imagining things? The quiet murmurs, the exchanged glances? Or was there something more beneath the surface? He knew he had solved the problem, but what if it hadn't been enough to truly prove himself? Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed one student, Tyler, a tall, blond kid with sharp features and a smug expression, looking at him from across the room. Tyler was the type of guy who had always excelled in the class, the one who was always a step ahead, the one who had the connections, the pedigree, the resources. He was the Harvard kid, born and raised in privilege. Tyler's eyes narrowed slightly as he walked over to Ludacris, and for a moment, Ludacris wondered if he was about to receive congratulations. But the words that came out of Tyler's mouth weren't exactly kind. "Nice job on the problem," Tyler said, his tone smooth but dripping with condescension. "But I don't think you really understand what you've done, do you?" Ludacris raised an eyebrow, confusion lacing his expression. "What do you mean?" "Look, I'm not trying to take anything away from you," Tyler continued, leaning against the desk. "But you're just a high school kid from, where again? Englewood? And now you're here solving a problem that even Professor Lawrence called unsolvable. You think you're just going to waltz in here and be on our level? What makes you think you're even close?" Ludacris felt the words sting, though he refused to let them show on his face. He had heard that tone of voice before, the one that treated him like a novelty, like someone who didn't belong in this world. It was the same tone that he had heard all his life, from kids who thought they were better than him simply because of the circumstances of their birth. "You don't know anything about me," Ludacris said, his voice steady, though his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "I'm here because I earned it. I solved that problem because I have something you don't." Tyler smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "Is that so? I guess we'll see how far that something gets you. The world doesn't work the way you think it does. You can't just rely on your raw talent," he said, putting air quotes around the words. "There's more to being in this class than solving some equation. You'll learn that the hard way." Before Ludacris could respond, Tyler turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a bitter taste in his mouth. The encounter lingered in his mind long after the classroom had emptied. As much as he wanted to dismiss Tyler's words, they gnawed at him. He had worked so hard to get here, so hard to prove that he was capable of so much more than what the world expected from a kid like him. But Tyler's words echoed in his mind, "You don't belong here. You're not like us. You'll never be on our level." The reality of what he was up against started to sink in. It wasn't just the math that was going to be difficult. It was the fact that no matter how much he succeeded, no matter how many equations he solved, there would always be someone like Tyler reminding him that he was an outsider. And the professors, were they any different? Professor Lawrence had praised him in front of the class, but Ludacris could sense something else in his gaze. It was as if the praise had come with an unspoken condition: "This was impressive for a kid like you, but you'll need more than just raw talent to make it in the world of academia." Ludacris left the classroom, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He walked through the halls of Harvard, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. He had always known that his journey here wouldn't be easy. He had been prepared for the challenges, being from a poor background, fighting against stereotypes, proving his worth to those who didn't believe in him. But this? This felt different. It wasn't just the academic pressure that was mounting. It was the growing sense that no matter what he accomplished, the people around him would always find a way to make him feel like he didn't belong. The next day, he showed up early for the class, hoping to get some clarity. The lecture hall was nearly empty when he entered, but to his surprise, Professor Lawrence was already there, standing by the board, scribbling notes with an intensity that made it clear he was lost in thought. "Good morning, Ludicrous," the professor said, glancing up as he entered. "I wanted to talk to you about yesterday." Ludicrous nodded, unsure of what to expect. "Sure. About the problem?" Professor Lawrence hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm still impressed with your solution. It was unexpected. I didn't think anyone would solve it, let alone a high school student." Ludicrous felt a rush of pride, but it was tempered by the memory of Tyler's words. "Thanks, Professor," he said, trying to sound casual. "But there's something I've been wondering. You said the problem was unsolvable. Was that just a test? A way to see if anyone could rise to the challenge?" Professor Lawrence's eyes softened. "No, Ludicrous. It was a real problem. I truly thought it couldn't be solved. But I see now that I was wrong. There's always more to learn, always new ways to approach things." He paused, his voice lowering. "But you should know, this world, it doesn't always reward raw talent alone. You'll need to prove yourself in more ways than one. There are expectations. Not just from me, but from everyone around you." The word struck Ludicrous harder than he expected. Expectations. He had heard that word before. It was the same word his mother had used when she pushed him to be better, when she had high hopes for his future. But it felt different coming from Professor Lawrence. It felt like a weight. "I understand," Ludicrous said quietly, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. As he left the classroom that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much harder. It wasn't just the math anymore. It was the fight for his place. The fight to prove that he wasn't just some anomaly, some kid who got lucky. He had earned his spot here, and he was going to show the world, and everyone who doubted him, that he belonged. The days that followed were a blur of equations, sleepless nights, and deep internal struggles. Ludicrous found himself questioning everything, doubting himself more than he ever had before. Despite solving an impossible problem, despite the initial praise from Professor Lawrence, the weight of his surroundings continued to press down on him. Tyler's words kept ringing in his ears, and the quiet whispers from his classmates, laced with skepticism, haunted his every step. He had done something extraordinary. He had defied the odds and cracked a problem that no one thought could be solved. But now, every moment at Harvard felt like a constant reminder that his victory hadn't erased the prejudices or the walls that stood between him and the world he was trying so desperately to belong to. It was the middle of the semester when things started to shift. It wasn't an immediate change, nothing in his life had ever been that easy. But something within him began to stir, a fire that refused to die out. Ludicrous realized he couldn't keep fighting the same battle every day. He couldn't continue proving to others that he belonged in this space, especially when they kept trying to push him back into the shadows. He had to find a different way forward, a way to rise above all of this and prove to himself that his success wasn't a fluke. It happened one cold evening in October. Ludicrous was in the library, surrounded by the hum of whispers and the tapping of keyboards. He was hunched over a stack of textbooks, scribbling notes, trying to wrap his mind around another complex concept that seemed to defy explanation. The math felt different now. It no longer felt like a place of refuge, a world where he could escape everything else. The equations felt like more of a challenge, a symbol of the weight he was carrying on his shoulders. As he worked through problem after problem, something clicked. He paused for a moment, staring at the equation in front of him, the variables swirling in his mind. The solution seemed elusive, like it was just out of reach. But then, in an instant, it came to him. It wasn't just the math he had been missing, it was his approach. He had been trying to solve it the same way everyone else did. But what if that wasn't the right way? What if there was a different method, a different perspective he hadn't considered? Ludacris scribbled down his new approach, his fingers moving rapidly over the paper. The more he wrote, the more he realized that this wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about breaking free from the constraints others had placed on him. It was about finding his own voice, his own way of approaching challenges. Before he could second-guess himself, Ludacris stood up and walked across the library to find Professor Lawrence. He had to share this with someone. He had to show that he wasn't just a product of his circumstances, that he could think differently, that he could find solutions where others saw none. The professor's office door was slightly ajar, and Ludacris hesitated for a moment before knocking. The last thing he wanted was to look foolish, to have his ideas dismissed. But there was something about this discovery, this breakthrough, that felt too important to keep to himself. "Professor Lawrence." Ludacris called out softly as he entered the office. The professor looked up from his desk, surprise flashing across his face. "Ludacris. What's on your mind?" "I think I found something," Ludacris said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "It's a new approach to the problem we discussed last week. I believe it could open up a whole new perspective on the equation. I think it could be the key to solving it completely." Professor Lawrence motioned for him to sit, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "All right, show me what you've got." Ludacris handed over his notebook, the pages filled with his scribbled equations and detailed steps. As the professor flipped through the pages, Ludacris couldn't help but feel a sense of nervous excitement. He had always trusted his instincts, but this was different. This wasn't just solving a problem, it was about pushing the boundaries, about taking everything he had learned and finding a new way to think about it. Professor Lawrence was silent for several moments, his brow furrowing as he studied Ludacris's work. Ludacris waited, trying to remain calm despite the growing tension in his chest. Finally, the professor looked up at him. His expression was unreadable. "This is impressive," he said slowly. "You've approached this from an angle that no one else has considered. This isn't just about solving the equation, it's about seeing the problem from a different perspective. You've turned it on its head." Ludacris felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a deeper sense of realization. This was it. This was what he had been looking for. This approach could change everything, Professor Lawrence continued, his voice growing more excited. It could lead to breakthroughs in areas we've only just begun to explore. I can't promise anything, but you've opened up a new avenue. We'll need to test it, refine it, but this is the kind of work that could change the field. Ludacris felt the weight of the moment settle around him. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the universe was finally aligning. All those late nights, all those moments of doubt, all the struggles, it was all worth it. He hadn't just solved a problem, he had found a way to change the way people thought about math, about solutions, about possibility. But as he left the professor's office, a new fear began to creep in. What if he was wrong? What if this breakthrough wasn't enough? What if, despite everything, he still didn't belong in this world? Those thoughts gnawed at him as he walked across the Harvard campus, the fall air crisp against his skin. He had come so far, but there were still so many obstacles in his path. He wasn't just fighting for a grade or a professor's approval. He was fighting for his place in the world, fighting for recognition not just from his peers, but from himself. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Ludacris and Professor Lawrence worked together to refine his approach, testing it against other unsolvable problems and finding even more groundbreaking results. Word of Ludacris's discovery began to spread, slowly at first, but with growing momentum. More professors, more students, started to take notice. But with that attention came even more resistance. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Some hailed him as a genius, while others dismissed him as a lucky kid who had stumbled upon something by accident. Tyler and the others in his class seemed more determined than ever to undermine him, to make him doubt his place in this world. They couldn't fathom how someone like him, someone who didn't have the right background, the right connections, could possibly achieve what they themselves had struggled with for years. But Ludacris didn't let their doubts slow him down. He couldn't afford to. He had worked too hard, and he was determined to prove to himself, to everyone, that he belonged here. The challenges weren't going away, they were only getting bigger. But with each hurdle, Ludacris grew stronger. He was beginning to see this journey not as a fight for acceptance, but as a fight to redefine the rules. To rewrite the narrative. No one could take this from him. Not Tyler. Not the whispers. Not even the weight of his past. He was ready for whatever came next. The days following Ludacris's breakthrough were a whirlwind, filled with both exhilaration and trepidation. The university's academic circles were abuzz with talk of his work. Word had spread quickly, and professors from different departments were reaching out to him, eager to test his methods and see if his unconventional approach could apply to other areas of mathematics. It was exhilarating to think that something he had discovered could potentially change the very foundations of the field. But with the excitement, the pressure also mounted. Expectations had shifted overnight. People no longer looked at Ludacris as just the high school kid who had found a fluke solution. Now, he was someone to watch, someone to challenge, someone whose work could either prove to be a fleeting success or a lasting revolution. The weight of the recognition pressed heavily on him, and each time he walked into class, it felt like every eye in the room was on him, scrutinizing his every move, every word. But it wasn't the professors or the students that weighed most heavily on Ludacris's mind. It was his family. Specifically, his mother, his greatest supporter and fiercest advocate. He had talked to her only once since arriving at Harvard. Her voice over the phone had been filled with pride and hope, but also worry. She had always believed in him, always pushed him to reach higher, to be better. But what did this new success mean for him? For them? Would this incredible opportunity be enough to lift them out of the hardship they had always lived with? Would it be enough to give him the future he'd worked so hard to earn? In the midst of all the academic breakthroughs, the whirlwind of praise, and the growing expectations, Ludacris found himself retreating inward, grappling with a sense of guilt he couldn't shake. The further he went into this world of academia, the more distant his family seemed. The victories, the acclaim, it was all starting to feel hollow, as though they were missing the one thing that had originally driven him, to make them proud, to change the course of their lives. One evening, sitting alone in his dorm room, Ludacris picked up his phone and dialed his mother's number. He stared at the screen as it rang, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he was going to say, he had so many conflicting emotions swirling inside him. He hadn't told her about the pressure, about the doubts, about how hard it was to face the walls that had been built around him. He hadn't told her about the way his peers treated him, about the constant feeling that he was just one mistake away from being cast aside. Hello. His mother's voice on the other end of the line was warm, comforting. Hi, Mom, Ludacris said, trying to steady his voice. How are you? I'm good, baby. How's Harvard? Are you making friends? I've been praying for you every day. I know you're going to do great things. Ludacris felt a lump form in his throat. He had always been the strong one, the one who kept his emotions in check, the one who kept his family's spirits high. But now, hearing his mother's voice, the weight of everything came crashing down on him. It's going okay, Mom, he said, his voice shaky. But it's hard. Really hard. What's going on? Tell me, she urged, her concern clear in her tone. Ludacris took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I'm not sure I belong here, you know. Everyone keeps telling me that I'm not like them, that I don't have the right background, the right pedigree. And sometimes, I wonder if they're right. I mean, I've solved some big problems, but I don't feel like I've really earned my place. It's like I'm constantly being told I'm not enough. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ludacris could hear his mother's steady breathing, could feel the weight of her love and her worry. When she finally spoke, her voice was strong, unwavering. "You've always been enough, baby," she said softly. "You've always been enough, and more. I know what it's like for people to look at you and see only what they want to see. They don't see the strength you've got inside of you. They don't see how hard you've worked to get here, how much you've sacrificed. But I see it. I've always seen it." Ludacris felt a tear slip down his cheek. It wasn't just about Harvard, about math, or the equations anymore. It was about the realization that he had been carrying the weight of his entire family on his shoulders, trying to prove something to the world, while all his mother had ever wanted was for him to be happy and proud of himself. "You've got the whole world ahead of you, Ludacris," his mother continued. "You've always had the potential to do great things. But don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve to be where you are. You've earned every step of it. And if you ever doubt that, just remember this: no matter where you go, no matter how high you climb, you'll always be my son, and I'll always be proud of you." The words were like a balm to his soul, soothing the jagged edges of his heart. Ludacris closed his eyes and let the tears flow freely now, no longer trying to hide the vulnerability he had been carrying with him for so long. "I miss you, Mom," he whispered. "I miss you too, baby," she replied. "But I know you're going to do amazing things. Just remember to stay true to yourself. You don't have to prove anything to anyone but you." That night, Ludacris sat in the dim light of his dorm room, his phone resting on the desk beside him. His heart felt lighter than it had in days, maybe even weeks. His mother's words echoed in his mind as he thought about everything that had led him to this point, his struggles, his doubts, his successes, and everything in between. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't about proving himself to the world. It was about proving to himself that he was worthy, not because of what others thought of him, but because of the strength and resilience he had carried with him all these years. Ludacris knew there would still be challenges ahead. The road wasn't going to get easier, and the whispers and doubts would continue to echo around him. But in that moment, he made a vow to himself: he wouldn't let anyone, no matter how many equations he solved, no matter how many doors he opened, define his worth. He would define it himself. The next day, as Ludacris walked into class, he felt different. He walked with his head held a little higher, his heart a little stronger. The weight of his past and the pressure of his present were still there, but now, he carried them with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just here to solve problems. He was here to show the world, and himself, that he belonged. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The weeks that followed Ludacris's late-night conversation with his mother were a blur of intense focus, newfound clarity, and small victories. There was a change in the air, one that he couldn't quite put his finger on, but he felt it with every step he took on the Harvard campus. It was as if the weight that had been bearing down on him had finally shifted, and for the first time, Ludacris felt like he could breathe a little easier. He was still facing the same challenges, the whispers, the doubts, the resistance from some of his peers. But now, those things no longer had the same power over him. He had learned to tune them out, to focus on the work in front of him, and most importantly, to trust in himself. Ludacris's breakthrough had already begun to make waves, and Professor Lawrence had been instrumental in helping him refine his work. The solution to the unsolvable problem had turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. As they worked together, Ludacris discovered even more applications for his approach, solutions that had never been considered before. Word of his work had reached some of the most respected figures in the field, and soon, his name was on the tip of everyone's tongue. He had gone from being the outsider to being someone who was beginning to change the way people thought about mathematics. But even with all the attention, the recognition, the praise, Ludacris knew that the real victory wasn't in the accolades, it was in how he had come to understand himself and his place in the world. One chilly afternoon, as Ludacris walked across the Harvard campus on his way to class, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. The ups and downs, the moments of doubt, the breakthroughs, and the setbacks. It had all been part of the journey. A journey that had, in many ways, been shaped by his past, by his family, his struggles, and his experiences in the small town where he had grown up. But now, standing here on this prestigious campus, he realized that the most important thing he had learned wasn't about solving impossible problems. It was about finding his own voice, about learning to trust in his ability, and about never letting anyone define his worth. The journey had never been just about proving others wrong. It had been about proving something to himself. That he wasn't just the kid from the wrong side of town. He was someone capable of greatness, someone who had the intelligence, the drive, and the heart to overcome any obstacle. It wasn't about having the perfect background or pedigree. It was about resilience, about determination, and about the belief that anything was possible if he was willing to work for it. That evening, Ludacris sat in his dorm room, staring at his phone, deep in thought. He hadn't spoken to his family much since that late-night conversation with his mom, but he knew he had to call them again. They were his foundation, the ones who had always believed in him when no one else did. They were the reason he had pushed himself so hard to get to this point. He owed them the truth. "Hey, Mom," he said when she picked up the phone. The sound of her voice immediately filled him with warmth. "Ludacris. How are you, baby? You've been so busy lately, I barely hear from you," she said, her voice light and filled with concern. "I'm doing okay, Mom." "Better than okay, actually," Ludacris replied, a smile tugging at his lips. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what all this is about." His mother laughed softly, a sound that always comforted him. "What do you mean? What do you understand now that you didn't before?" Ludacris paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "I get it now, Mom. It's not just about the math, or the recognition, or even the breakthroughs. It's about knowing that I belong here, no matter where I come from. It's about realizing that I'm enough just as I am." There was a silence on the other end of the line, followed by a soft sigh. Ludacris could picture his mother smiling to herself, her proud, loving smile. "I've always known that, baby. I've always known you were enough. And I'm so proud of you. You've come so far. But I can tell you've learned something even more important than any formula or equation could teach you. You've learned to believe in yourself." Ludacris felt his heart swell with emotion. "I've been trying so hard to prove myself, to show the world that I belong. But I realize now that the only person I need to prove anything to is myself." "Exactly," his mother said softly. "You don't need anyone's approval to know how far you've come. The fact that you've made it this far, despite everything, says more about you than anything else. You've earned this, Ludacris. And no matter where life takes you from here, you will always be enough." Those words, simple but profound, settled deep inside of him. They weren't just comforting words from a mother. They were the truth, and they reminded him of something he had almost forgotten along the way. Success wasn't about pleasing others or fitting into someone else's idea of what he should be. It was about finding peace within himself, about knowing that he had the strength and the ability to face whatever challenges came his way. Over the next few weeks, Ludacris continued to make strides in his work. His collaboration with Professor Lawrence had led to a published paper, a groundbreaking paper that received attention from some of the leading mathematicians in the world. His peers who had once looked at him with skepticism were now approaching him with respect, eager to discuss his theories, to collaborate on future projects. But more than anything, Ludacris felt a sense of fulfillment that transcended the accolades or the recognition. He had come to Harvard as a kid with a dream, a kid from a small town who didn't belong in a place like this. But now, he was not just a student at Harvard. He was a force in the world of academia. He had shown the world that anyone could achieve greatness, regardless of their background. And, most importantly, he had learned to trust in his own voice, to believe that he was enough just as he was. As he sat in his dorm room, reflecting on everything that had brought him to this moment, Ludacris knew that the journey was far from over. There would be more obstacles, more challenges, more moments of doubt. But now, he understood that those challenges didn't define him. His determination, his resilience, and his belief in himself were what truly mattered. And as he looked forward to the future, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready. The story of Ludacris, the kid from the wrong side of town who had solved the impossible problem, had just begun. It was just after the winter break when things took another unexpected turn. Ludacris had settled into a rhythm at Harvard, a balance between classes, research, and the occasional social activity. His breakthrough in mathematics had opened doors for him that he had never imagined, and though there were still whispers and occasional moments of doubt, he was learning to navigate them. The feeling of belonging was growing stronger, but little did he know, the next chapter of his journey was about to take a sharp turn. It happened one cold morning, a week into the spring semester. Ludacris was sitting in the library, buried deep in his textbooks, preparing for his upcoming exams when his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Professor Lawrence. The subject line was simple, but its contents would send Ludacris's world into motion. Ludacris, I need to speak with you as soon as possible. It's about your work, and there's something you need to see. The message was cryptic, and the urgency in it made Ludacris's pulse quicken. He had been working alongside Professor Lawrence on several papers, and the professor had always been supportive. But this felt different. Something about it didn't sit right. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of something monumental. Without hesitation, Ludacris grabbed his coat, stuffed his books into his bag, and made his way across campus to Professor Lawrence's office. It was an unusually cold day for early March, and as he walked briskly through the snow-dusted paths of the university, his mind raced. What could this be about? Was it a new problem to solve? Or had something gone wrong with their research? Either way, Ludacris knew that whatever it was, he had to be prepared. When he reached the professor's office, he knocked 3 times before stepping inside. Professor Lawrence was sitting behind his desk, staring at his computer screen, but his face was serious. Ludacris immediately noticed the difference in the air. There was a palpable tension in the room, something that hadn't been there before. Sit down, Ludacris, Professor Lawrence said without looking up. His voice was calm but had a distinct edge to it. Ludacris sat across from him, trying to read the professor's expression, but his face was inscrutable. After what felt like an eternity, Professor Lawrence finally spoke. I've been contacted by some of the biggest names in the field, people who have taken an interest in your work. Specifically, your solution to the unsolvable problem. They want you to come to a symposium in Washington, D.C. in a few weeks. It's not just a typical academic conference. This is a gathering of top mathematicians, physicists, and researchers from all over the world. Ludacris blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. Wait, hold on. You mean to say that these people want to hear from me? Professor Lawrence nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. They do. But it's more than just a presentation. They want you to help solve another problem, one that is considered far more complicated than the one you've already solved. Ludacris's heart skipped a beat. The idea of being asked to collaborate with some of the world's leading intellectuals was both thrilling and terrifying. He had barely begun to understand the magnitude of his breakthrough, and now it seemed like the world was asking him to step into the lion's den. What's the catch? Ludacris asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Why me? I'm still just a student, and I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that. Professor Lawrence studied him for a moment, as though weighing the words he was about to say. Then, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. Ludacris, you're not just any student. Your work has already shown that you have a mind unlike anyone else's. And frankly, there are people out there who believe that you're the one who can unlock the next great mystery in mathematics. I've seen what you can do, and I believe you're ready. This could be the chance of a lifetime. But I also want you to understand the responsibility that comes with it. The weight of the moment pressed down on Ludacris. He thought back to everything that had led him here, his struggles, his doubts, and all the times he had wondered if he was truly good enough. And now, here he was, being offered a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to not only further his own work but to potentially change the course of history. But that responsibility, it felt heavy. It felt like a burden that could crush him if he wasn't careful. Professor Lawrence continued, "There's no pressure, Ludicrous. But I think this is something you should seriously consider. This is your call to adventure. It's a big step, and I can't make this decision for you. But I know this, if you decide to take it, you'll be stepping into a new chapter of your life. One that could define everything you've worked for up to this point." Ludicrous stared at the professor, processing everything he had just heard. His heart was pounding in his chest. The thought of standing before a room full of the world's best minds, of being the one to solve an even more complex problem, was overwhelming. And yet, a part of him felt an undeniable pull. This was what he had worked for. This was what he had dreamed of when he first sat down with his textbooks all those years ago, trying to make sense of the world. "I need some time to think about it," Ludicrous said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. Professor Lawrence smiled slightly. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But just know, this could be the defining moment of your career. No pressure, of course." Ludicrous stood up and walked toward the door, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. As he stepped into the cold, snowy air outside, he paused and took a deep breath. The weight of the decision was clear, but so was the excitement. This was his moment to prove not just to the world, but to himself, that he was ready. Ready to take that next step. Ready to face the next challenge. He had always believed that the best way to overcome his struggles was through action, and now, the universe was giving him the ultimate test. He wasn't sure what awaited him in Washington, D.C., but one thing was certain, this was the adventure he had been waiting for. And Ludicrous was ready. As he walked back to his dorm, the world around him seemed to open up, full of possibilities. What came next was unknown, but one thing was for sure, his journey was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. The days leading up to the symposium in Washington, D.C. felt like a whirlwind for Ludicrous. After his conversation with Professor Lawrence, his mind was consumed with a mix of excitement and anxiety. The opportunity was once in a lifetime, but it was also terrifying. Standing in front of some of the brightest minds in the world, people who had spent their entire lives working on problems that seemed unsolvable, would require more than just intellect. It would require confidence, humility, and a readiness to fail. As the day of the symposium grew nearer, Ludicrous spent every waking moment preparing. He pored over his research, refining his theories, reviewing his notes on the unsolvable problem he had already solved, and trying to grasp the scope of the new problem he had been asked to help with. Each new piece of information he uncovered felt like a small victory, but also like another mountain to climb. Though Ludicrous had grown accustomed to academic rigor at Harvard, the pressure now felt unlike anything he had ever experienced. This wasn't just about impressing his professors or peers, this was about making his mark on the global stage. It was a test of not only his intellectual capacity but also his courage, his resilience, and his ability to stand his ground in a room full of people who had far more experience than he did. The night before his flight to Washington, Ludicrous sat on his bed, staring at the window. The soft glow of the streetlights outside barely illuminated his room, but it was enough to reflect the thoughts running through his head. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother, reminding him to stay calm and focused, and to never forget where he came from. "No matter what happens, Ludicrous, you are enough. You've always been enough. Go show them what you're made of." Her words brought him a sense of peace, grounding him amidst the storm of uncertainty. He was more than just the sum of his past struggles and triumphs, he was his own person, capable of facing whatever came his way. The next morning, Ludicrous boarded a plane to Washington, D.C. The city greeted him with its crisp, early spring air, and the skyline gleamed with the promise of something monumental. As he took a taxi to the conference venue, he couldn't help but marvel at how far he had come. Just a few years ago, He had been a kid dreaming of academic greatness in a small town, and now, here he was, standing at the threshold of something bigger than he could have imagined. The symposium was being held at a prestigious academic conference center, with high ceilings, glass walls, and bustling hallways filled with the sharpest minds in the world. Ludacris could feel the energy in the air as he walked through the crowded lobby. Researchers, professors, and students alike were engaged in animated conversations, some about the latest developments in physics, others discussing groundbreaking theories in mathematics. He could already feel the weight of the competition, and the expectations bearing down on him. But Ludacris wasn't just here to compete. He was here to learn, to contribute, and to prove to himself that he belonged. After all, the real challenge wasn't proving himself to others. It was proving to himself that he could rise to the occasion. The first session of the symposium was a blur of presentations, discussions, and intellectual challenges. Ludacris sat in the back of the room, listening intently to the speakers, each one presenting their latest research with the confidence and authority of someone who had been in the field for decades. The complexities of their work seemed far beyond him, but as the day went on, he began to feel something stirring within him, a quiet confidence that he too had something important to contribute. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it was time for Ludacris to take the stage. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked to the front of the room, his hands trembling slightly. He set his laptop on the podium and glanced out at the audience, dozens of the most brilliant minds in the world, all staring at him with expectant eyes. His throat felt dry, but he forced himself to breathe, just as his mother had taught him. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice surprisingly steady for the nerves that threatened to overtake him. "My name is Ludacris Johnson, and today, I'm here to share a new perspective on a problem that's been plaguing us for decades. A problem that some have called unsolvable, but as I've come to realize, there's always a way forward if we approach it differently." The room fell silent. Ludacris could feel the weight of their gaze, and the pressure of the moment seemed to intensify. He could almost hear the whispering doubts in his mind, but he pushed them aside. This was his moment. He wasn't just speaking to impress them, he was speaking to share something that could change the way they thought about mathematics, and maybe even the world. He clicked a button on his laptop, and a complex equation appeared on the screen behind him. It was the same equation that had been dubbed unsolvable, a problem that had stumped some of the brightest minds for years. But to Ludacris, it was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. "I want to take a different approach," he continued, pacing slowly as he explained his theory. "What if the problem isn't the equation itself, but rather the assumptions we've made about it? What if the key to solving it lies in questioning the very framework we've built around it?" The room was still, and Ludacris could feel the tension rising as he continued to speak, breaking down his approach step by step. He spoke with a quiet conviction, carefully articulating each idea, each nuance, hoping that his audience could follow his thought process. The more he spoke, the more he realized that the audience wasn't just listening, they were engaged. They were thinking. When he finally finished, Ludacris took a deep breath and waited. The silence that followed seemed endless, and for a moment, doubt crept back into his mind. Had he said too much? Was his theory too radical for them to accept? Then, as if on cue, one of the senior mathematicians in the front row stood up. Ludacris recognized him as Dr. Evelyn Harris, a renowned expert in theoretical mathematics. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, and then spoke. "Fascinating," she said, her voice sharp with curiosity. "You're suggesting that the entire paradigm we've been working within may be flawed, and that there's a completely different way to approach the problem. This is unconventional, but I believe you're onto something. This could be a game changer." Ludacris's heart leapt in his chest. It wasn't just the praise, though it felt good to hear, it was the recognition that his ideas were having an impact. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't just a student anymore. He was a part of something much larger than himself. As the discussion continued, Ludacris felt a sense of pride and belonging he had never experienced before. The journey he had started so many years ago, as a kid from a small town trying to prove himself, had led him here, to a room full of people who now saw him not as an outsider, but as someone who could change the field of mathematics. And this was only the beginning. The days that followed Ludacris's presentation at the symposium were a blur. His mind was still reeling from the whirlwind of events, the excitement of being in Washington, D.C., the pressure of presenting his theory to the world's brightest minds, and the overwhelming realization that his work was gaining traction in ways he had never imagined. Yet, as much as the praise from Dr. Evelyn Harris and others had bolstered his confidence, it also introduced a nagging sense of doubt that lurked in the back of his mind. Ludacris found himself questioning everything. Was his theory truly groundbreaking, or had he simply stumbled upon a fluke? Could he really carry this forward and prove it, or had he merely opened a door that would lead him down a path to failure? These questions haunted him as he sat in his hotel room in Washington, staring out at the city skyline, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the responsibility that had suddenly been thrust upon him. The symposium had opened new doors, but it had also raised the stakes. People were paying attention. And with attention came expectation. What if he couldn't live up to it? What if he failed? He could hear the whispers of doubt echoing in his mind, louder than any of the praise he had received earlier that day. The pressure intensified the next morning when he was invited to a private dinner with some of the leading mathematicians at the symposium. It was a small gathering, meant for intellectuals to discuss the day's presentations and share their ideas in a more intimate setting. Ludacris felt a sense of awe as he entered the elegant restaurant, surrounded by people who had shaped the field of mathematics for decades. These were the giants upon whose shoulders he had been standing for most of his academic life. As they sat down, the conversation quickly turned to the unsolvable problem that Ludacris had presented. His heart began to race as he listened to their thoughts on his theory. Some were skeptical, while others seemed genuinely intrigued. Dr. Harris was one of the latter, nodding thoughtfully as she listened to Ludacris explain his approach once more. "I must admit, Ludacris, your perspective is fresh," Dr. Harris said, her voice filled with both curiosity and skepticism. "But the road you're suggesting is incredibly uncharted. If we follow this path, we're not just redefining a theory, we're changing the very foundation of how we understand mathematics. That's a dangerous game to play." Ludacris nodded, trying to suppress the nerves that threatened to overwhelm him. He had always known that this would be the case. Any revolutionary theory had its risks, its naysayers, and its challenges. But now, sitting at this table with some of the most respected figures in the field, the reality of those risks felt even more immediate. "So, what do you think?" Ludacris asked, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his chest. Dr. Harris paused, taking a sip of her wine before answering. "I think you've stumbled upon something important. But I also think you need to be cautious. If you push too hard, too quickly, the academic community will tear your work apart before it even has a chance to breathe. You have to consider the consequences, both for your theory and for your reputation. If it fails, well, it will be hard to recover from that." The weight of her words landed heavily on Ludacris. He had never considered the possibility of failure in such stark terms. Yes, he had thought about the implications of his work, but the thought that his career could be jeopardized by one misstep was a reality he hadn't fully grasped until now. As the dinner continued, Ludacris felt a growing sense of isolation. The conversation seemed to drift away from him as he found himself lost in thought. The others around him continued to debate his theory, but Ludacris couldn't shake the feeling that the more they discussed it, the more fragile his position seemed. He had to be perfect. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. And yet, the more he tried to convince himself of that, the more unsure he became. By the time the dinner ended, Ludacris was exhausted, mentally, physically, and emotionally. He felt as though the weight of the world had been placed squarely on his shoulders, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to bear it. He thanked the group, excused himself, and returned to his hotel room, his mind swirling with doubts and fears. As he lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, Ludacris thought about the journey that had brought him here. He thought about his childhood, about the struggles he had faced growing up, and about the dreams that had always seemed so far out of reach. But now, those dreams were within his grasp. He had come so far, and yet, in some ways, he felt like he was standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of whether he would soar or fall. The following morning, as he prepared to leave Washington, Ludacris received an email from Professor Lawrence. The message was short but to the point. "Ludacris, we need to talk. There's something I've been meaning to share with you, and I believe it's important. Meet me when you get back to campus." The weight of those words settled on him like a heavy fog. What could it be? Was it good news, or was there another layer to this story that he hadn't yet uncovered? For the first time since his arrival in Washington, Ludacris felt a deep, gnawing sense of fear. Was Professor Lawrence going to tell him something he didn't want to hear? He boarded the flight back to Cambridge with a sense of dread in his chest. The excitement of the symposium had been replaced by uncertainty, and for the first time in months, Ludacris found himself questioning whether he was truly ready for everything that had been set in motion. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Ludacris stared out the window, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had come this far, but now, standing at the crossroads of confidence and doubt, he didn't know what the next step would be. Would he continue forward, confident in his abilities, or would he retreat into the safety of what he knew? Only time would tell. But Ludacris knew one thing for sure: this journey was far from over. Ludacris returned to Cambridge with a heavy heart. The excitement of the symposium was still fresh in his mind, but now, the thrill of his accomplishments felt overshadowed by the gnawing doubt that had settled within him. The conversations at the dinner, particularly Dr. Harris's words, weighed on him like a stone around his neck. What if his theory wasn't as solid as he had hoped? What if he was just another young student who had been too eager to prove himself, only to end up making a fool of himself in front of the world's brightest minds? As soon as he stepped off the plane, Ludacris went straight to the office of Professor Lawrence. His professor had asked him to meet as soon as he returned, and Ludacris knew that the conversation wouldn't be an easy one. What could Professor Lawrence want to discuss? Was it about his presentation? Had he somehow made a critical error? He walked into the professor's office with his stomach in knots, but as soon as he saw the familiar face of Professor Lawrence, his anxiety began to ease, even if just slightly. The professor was seated behind his desk, papers neatly stacked around him. He looked up when Ludacris entered, offering a welcoming smile. "Ludacris, it's good to see you back. Please, take a seat." Professor Lawrence gestured to the chair across from his desk. Ludacris sat down, trying to keep his composure. "Thank you, Professor. I got back from D.C. last night. It was an incredible experience, but," he trailed off, not quite sure how to express the inner turmoil he had been carrying since he left. "I read the reports from the symposium," Professor Lawrence said, his voice calm and measured. "Your presentation was impressive. You've gained attention, Ludacris. But there's something more we need to talk about, something that's been on my mind." Ludacris swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if he was relieved to hear that his presentation had been well received or if it only made the situation feel even more daunting. He had been thrust into a spotlight that he wasn't sure he was prepared for. "Professor, I've been thinking about what Dr. Harris said," Ludacris began, his voice faltering. "She said my theory could change the foundation of mathematics, but she also warned me about the consequences of pushing too quickly. What if I'm wrong? What if all this is just a mistake?" Professor Lawrence leaned back in his chair, his expression softening as he studied Ludacris. "You're not wrong to have doubts. Every groundbreaking discovery comes with a risk. It's natural to question yourself, especially when you're stepping into uncharted territory. But let me tell you something, Ludacris, what you've done is nothing short of extraordinary." Ludacris looked up, his eyes searching the professor's face for any hint of insincerity. But there was none. Professor Lawrence's calm demeanor had always been a source of comfort for him, and now, it seemed as if that same calmness was what he needed most. You've solved something that others have been wrestling with for years, Ludicrous. You've looked at an unsolvable problem from a new angle, and that alone is something remarkable. But the real question is, what do you want to do with this discovery? Are you going to let fear stop you, or will you embrace the challenge ahead? The question struck Ludicrous deeply. He had spent so much time worrying about the potential fallout from his discovery that he hadn't stopped to consider why he was doing this in the first place. Why had he gone down this path? What was it that drove him to solve problems that seemed unsolvable? He wasn't just trying to prove something to the world, he was trying to prove something to himself. I don't want to back down, Ludicrous said, his voice firmer now. I know this is bigger than me. It's bigger than any one person. But I need to be sure I'm doing the right thing. I don't want to mess this up. Professor Lawrence nodded. I understand. But remember, no great discovery ever came without risks. The key is not to be afraid of the challenge but to approach it with a clear mind and the courage to see it through. If you believe in your theory, then follow it. But also be prepared to listen, to adapt, to grow, and to learn as you go. The journey ahead won't be easy, but if you stay true to your instincts, I have no doubt that you'll make it. Ludicrous absorbed the professor's words, feeling a new sense of clarity beginning to form in his mind. He had spent so much time worrying about the consequences of failure that he hadn't allowed himself to truly embrace the process of discovery. There was no certainty in any field of research, especially not one as complex as mathematics. But that was part of the beauty of it. The uncertainty was where growth happened. The journey was just as important as the destination. Thank you, Professor, Ludicrous said, feeling a renewed sense of determination. I think I've been focused on all the wrong things. It's not about being perfect. It's about making progress. I need to keep moving forward. Professor Lawrence smiled, a look of pride in his eyes. That's the spirit, Ludicrous. Keep pushing. And remember, you're not alone in this. We're all here to support you, every step of the way. As Ludicrous left the professor's office, a weight seemed to lift off his shoulders. The doubts that had plagued him for days began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet but growing confidence. He wasn't done yet. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were only beginning, but for the first time in a long while, Ludicrous felt ready to face whatever came next. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Ludicrous poured himself back into his research with renewed vigor, refining his theories, testing his assumptions, and seeking out new ways to explore the problem he had been working on. The more he delved into it, the more he realized that his initial instincts had been right. There was something here, a breakthrough, a key that had been overlooked by those who had come before him. And he wasn't about to let fear or doubt stop him from finding it. Along the way, Ludicrous began to build relationships with other researchers and professors who were intrigued by his work. While some remained skeptical, others saw the potential in his approach. They became his allies, offering feedback, suggestions, and encouragement as he refined his theory. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, days when the problem seemed impossible to solve, and nights when Ludicrous felt like giving up. But with each new discovery, with each small step forward, he felt his confidence growing. He had come to realize that failure wasn't the end, it was just another part of the journey. And as Ludicrous continued on that journey, he knew one thing for sure, he was no longer just a kid from a small town. He was a force to be reckoned with, someone who had the courage to take on the impossible, and to succeed. Ludicrous had made incredible strides in his research. With each passing day, his theory gained more clarity, and his confidence in his findings grew. The feedback from his peers and professors was increasingly positive, and for the first time, he began to feel as though he was truly on the path to something groundbreaking. He had worked tirelessly, revising, refining, and expanding his ideas, and now it seemed that his vision was not only plausible but possibly on the verge of being accepted. However, just as things seemed to be falling into place, Ludicrous encountered his first true obstacle. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he first heard the whispers. At a meeting of the mathematics department, a senior professor named Dr. Nathaniel Ford, a respected figure in the field, brought up his work during a seminar on advanced theories. Dr. Ford, known for his sharp intellect but equally sharp tongue, had a reputation for dismissing new ideas that he deemed impractical or ungrounded in traditional mathematics. It was clear that Ludicrous's theory had caught his attention, but not in a way that made Ludicrous feel welcomed. "I've been following Ludicrous's work with some interest," Dr. Ford began, his voice echoing through the room. "But I have to say, I find his conclusions problematic, at best. His approach to solving the problem is unconventional, and frankly, there are aspects of his work that border on the irresponsible." Ludicrous felt a chill run through him. His heart sank. He had expected resistance from some, but hearing it from Dr. Ford, a man he had admired, was different. The room went quiet as all eyes turned to the professor, waiting for him to elaborate. "Mathematics isn't about throwing out established principles and hoping that something sticks," Dr. Ford continued, his tone laced with disdain. "If we allow such theories to circulate without proper scrutiny, we risk undermining the very foundations of our discipline." Ludicrous's stomach twisted. He had been anticipating some level of criticism, but this felt personal. It wasn't just about his work, it was about his very place in the academic community. "I understand that my theory is unconventional," Ludicrous replied, trying to keep his voice steady, though his nerves were threatening to betray him. "But the evidence supports it. I've tested it thoroughly, and the results are consistent." "That's the problem," Dr. Ford retorted sharply. "You've only tested it within your narrow framework, without considering the broader implications. Your conclusions, though intriguing, are based on incomplete data. You can't just cherry-pick your findings to fit a hypothesis and call it a breakthrough. That's not how science works." The words hit Ludicrous like a punch to the gut. He had spent so much time refining his theory, so much energy ensuring that it held up under scrutiny. But now, in front of a room full of colleagues, he was being accused of cutting corners. The sting of Dr. Ford's words reverberated in his chest. Professor Lawrence, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, finally spoke up, his voice calm and authoritative. "I disagree with you, Nathaniel. Ludicrous has approached this problem with rigor and dedication. His theory deserves to be taken seriously, and if it's proven right, it will revolutionize our understanding of this field." Ludicrous glanced at Professor Lawrence, feeling a rush of gratitude. But Dr. Ford wasn't finished. "We'll see," Dr. Ford said dismissively. "Theoretical mathematics isn't just about passion, Ludicrous. It's about precision. And your theory, as it stands, is far from precise." The meeting continued, but Ludicrous's mind was reeling. The words from Dr. Ford echoed in his ears, drowning out everything else. He had known there would be opposition, but the harshness of it stung more than he had anticipated. He had always respected Dr. Ford, and to hear such criticism from him was a blow to his confidence. What if Dr. Ford was right? What if he had missed something crucial? What if the foundation of his work was flawed? As the seminar concluded, Ludicrous excused himself and left the room quickly, unable to bear the weight of the conversation any longer. He walked briskly through the campus, the cool autumn air doing little to calm the storm that was brewing inside of him. His thoughts were a jumbled mess. Was this the beginning of the end? Was his dream of revolutionizing mathematics going to crumble before his eyes? Ludicrous found himself at the edge of the Charles River, staring out at the water. The gentle ripples seemed to mock his turmoil, their steady movement a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. He had come so far. He had worked so hard to get to this point. And now, just when things seemed to be aligning, he was faced with doubt from someone whose opinion he respected. How could he move forward if the academic community was so divided on his work? Minutes passed, and Ludicrous's frustration began to give way to a quiet resolve. He had fought for this theory. He had believed in it when no one else did. Why should he let one person's doubts shatter his conviction? He pulled out his phone and sent a message to Professor Lawrence. "Can we meet?" I need to talk. Within minutes, he received a reply, of course. Come to my office when you're ready. Ludacris took a deep breath and turned back toward the campus. He knew what he had to do. The criticism from Dr. Ford had shaken him, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had made him more determined to prove that he was right. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed to hear Professor Lawrence's perspective, to get guidance from someone who believed in him. When he entered Professor Lawrence's office, the professor looked up and gave him a reassuring smile. What's on your mind, Ludacris? I don't know how to move forward, Ludacris admitted, sinking into the chair across from him. Dr. Ford, he doesn't think my theory has merit. And the worst part is, part of me wonders if he's right. What if I've missed something? Professor Lawrence's expression softened. It's natural to doubt yourself when someone you respect challenges your work. But remember this, Ludacris, every great mathematician has faced opposition. Every time someone tries to break new ground, there are those who will stand in their way. That's part of the process. But what if I'm wrong? Ludacris asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. What if I'm just wasting my time? You're not wasting your time, Professor Lawrence said firmly. You found something. You've opened a door that others didn't even know existed. Now, it's about persistence. Don't let one voice, however loud it may be, drown out your own conviction. Keep testing, keep refining, and above all, keep believing in your work. The path you're on is difficult, but it's also where true innovation lies. Ludacris felt a sense of calm wash over him as he listened to his mentor's words. For the first time since the seminar, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Dr. Ford's criticism was just another obstacle, one that he would have to overcome on his journey. If he was going to make this breakthrough, he would have to weather the storms of doubt and opposition. He stood up, a feeling of clarity settling over him. Thank you, Professor. I know what I need to do now. Professor Lawrence smiled warmly. I believe in you, Ludacris. Now, go show the world what you're capable of. As Ludacris left the office, his mind was no longer clouded with doubt. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. He had a theory to prove, and no amount of criticism, no matter how harsh, was going to stop him. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ludacris's determination had been reignited. Professor Lawrence's words rang in his ears, a steady reminder that opposition wasn't a sign of failure, it was part of the journey. But as he sat down to rework his theory, his mind kept returning to the same question: how could he prove that he was right in the face of growing skepticism? The days that followed were a blur of numbers, equations, and sleepless nights. He pored over his notes, constantly refining his approach, testing his hypotheses again and again. Every time he thought he was close to a breakthrough, something would slip through his fingers, a small inconsistency, a detail that didn't quite add up. The pressure was mounting. Dr. Ford's criticisms haunted him, and the fear of failure began to claw at the edges of his thoughts once again. Then, one evening, as Ludacris sat hunched over a stack of papers in the campus library, he noticed something unexpected. It wasn't the usual crowd of students around him. The library was mostly empty, the only sound the soft rustling of pages and the hum of fluorescent lights above him. A shadow fell across his desk. He looked up, startled, to see a familiar face. It was Tamara, a classmate he hadn't really interacted with much before. She was known for being quiet, highly intelligent, and a bit of an enigma among their peers. But she was also someone who had often surprised others with her sharp insights during class discussions. Ludacris hadn't expected to see her here, and certainly not at this hour. "Hey, Ludacris," she said softly, her voice almost hesitant. "Mind if I sit?" Ludacris blinked, unsure of what to make of this sudden encounter. Sure," he replied, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. Tamara settled into the chair, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders as she pulled out a notebook and began to write. She didn't speak for a while, and Ludacris wasn't sure if she was going to acknowledge his presence at all. Finally, she broke the silence. "I heard about your theory. The one that Dr. Ford doesn't think will work." Ludacris's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if he was flattered or surprised that Tamara knew about his work, given how little they had interacted. But there was something in the way she said it, like she wasn't judging, just stating a fact. "I'm working on it," Ludacris replied, a little more defensively than he meant to. "Trying to figure out where I went wrong." Tamara nodded, her gaze focused on her notebook. "I've been thinking about it. I think you're onto something." Ludacris raised an eyebrow. "You do?" She looked up at him, her expression serious. "Yeah. I've been looking over some of your papers. The logic is solid, Ludacris. The problem isn't the theory, it's the way you're presenting it. Dr. Ford isn't wrong that you've skipped a few steps, but that doesn't mean your conclusions are incorrect." Ludacris sat back, stunned. He hadn't expected this at all. Tamara, of all people, was agreeing with him. It was more than he could have hoped for, but her words also stirred a sense of confusion. How did she, of all people, understand the depth of what he was working on? "How do you know all of this?" Ludacris asked, trying to mask his surprise. "I've been studying the same problem," she replied, a quiet confidence in her voice. "Not in the same way you have, but I've been exploring some of the same concepts in my own work. I've come to similar conclusions in some areas. I think we're just approaching it from different angles." Ludacris blinked, unable to fully process what she was saying. "You've been working on the same thing. Why didn't you say anything?" Tamara smiled faintly, almost as though she were amused by his question. "I didn't think you'd be interested in hearing from someone like me. We're not exactly in the same circles, you know." Ludacris was taken aback by her words. He had never really considered Tamara as someone who could offer valuable input on his work. She was quiet, almost invisible at times. But now, seeing her before him with a notebook filled with notes that could potentially help him, he realized how much he had underestimated her. "I don't care about circles," he said, his voice softening. "If you've been working on something similar, we should be talking about it. You don't understand, Tamara. This theory, it's everything. It could change everything. But I'm starting to think maybe I've missed something. Maybe I'm just wasting my time." Tamara tilted her head, her eyes studying him with an intensity that was unusual for her. "You're not wasting your time," she said, her voice steady. "What you're doing is important. It might not be easy, but you're pushing boundaries. We don't make progress by sticking to what's already known, Ludacris. We make progress by questioning everything." Ludacris stared at her, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. "But what if I'm wrong? What if I've made a mistake?" "Then you'll fix it," she replied, her tone unflinching. "That's how you learn. I think you're close, Ludacris. I can feel it. There's something there, and I want to help you find it." Ludacris felt a rush of emotions surge through him. He had been so focused on proving himself that he hadn't allowed himself to truly collaborate. He had been isolating himself, thinking that he had to solve everything on his own. But Tamara's words were a wake-up call. He didn't have to go through this alone. "I don't know what to say," Ludacris muttered, his voice thick with gratitude. "I could really use someone to bounce ideas off of." Tamara smiled warmly, a genuine kindness in her eyes. "I'll help you. I can look over your work, offer suggestions. We can work through this together." For the first time in a long while, Ludacris felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had been so caught up in the idea of working alone, convinced that his success, or failure, rested entirely on his own shoulders. But now, with Tamara's unexpected support, he felt like the weight was beginning to lift. "Thank you," he said quietly, feeling the sincerity of the words. Over the next few weeks, Tamara became a crucial part of Ludacris's research. They worked late into the night, analyzing equations, testing hypotheses, and refining their theories. With her sharp insights and fresh perspective, Ludacris began to see his work in a new light. She didn't just help him solve problems, she helped him think about the problem differently. The combination of their ideas was proving to be powerful, and for the first time, Ludacris felt like he wasn't alone in this monumental challenge. But there was still the matter of Dr. Ford. Despite Tamara's support, Ludacris knew that he would have to confront the skepticism and doubts that were swirling around his work. If he wanted to prove his theory, and his place in the academic world, he would have to take a bold step. And Ludacris knew that the time to take that step was fast approaching. The work with Tamara had been an unexpected blessing for Ludacris. What started as a hesitant conversation in the library had blossomed into a full-on collaboration. Their minds meshed in ways Ludacris had never anticipated. Tamara, with her fresh perspective and sharp analytical skills, had become more than just a fellow researcher, she had become his ally, a partner in the truest sense of the word. Together, they were making strides that Ludacris could not have imagined before. But despite the progress they were making, the pressure was beginning to mount. The academic world, particularly the upper echelons, were still skeptical of Ludacris's theory. Dr. Ford's words had left a lingering shadow, and now, with the breakthrough seemingly in reach, Ludacris knew that he had to go public with his findings. He had to present them in a way that couldn't be ignored, especially if he wanted to silence the critics once and for all. The next major step was the upcoming Symposium on Advanced Mathematical Theories. It was a prestigious event, drawing the top minds from across the globe. For Ludacris, it was the perfect opportunity to present his work, to show that his theory had not only merit but the potential to redefine the field. But the closer the event came, the more anxious Ludacris became. The symposium would bring with it more than just praise or recognition, it would bring the fiercest scrutiny. The moment he stepped onto that stage, he would be facing the very critics who had doubted him, particularly Dr. Ford. Could he stand up to the pressure? Could he deliver his findings without faltering? On the eve of the symposium, Ludacris found himself pacing in his small apartment. The room was cluttered with papers, books, and scribbled equations, remnants of the sleepless nights he had spent over the past few weeks. He had rehearsed his presentation a dozen times in front of his mirror, tweaking his slides and refining his speech, but the doubts kept creeping in. What if they still didn't believe him? What if they laughed him off the stage? He had worked so hard to get here, but could it all fall apart in an instant? Tamara had been a constant source of reassurance. Over the past few weeks, she had become not only a colleague but a friend. She had encouraged him to push forward, even when the days seemed bleak, and her confidence in his work had become a rock for him to lean on. She had seen something in his theory long before he'd been able to see it himself. "You've got this, Ludacris," she had said just hours before. "You've done the work. You've earned this opportunity. Now it's time to let everyone else see it." He wasn't sure if her words were meant to comfort him or to push him forward, but they worked. Ludacris looked at his notes one last time, and then he closed the folder. He had done everything he could. Now, all that was left was to trust in his own abilities, and in the theory that had come to define his academic career. The day of the symposium arrived, and Ludacris stood before an audience that included some of the sharpest minds in the field of mathematics. The venue was packed, the energy palpable. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him as he took the stage, the nerves in his stomach a knot that seemed to tighten with every step he took. Dr. Ford was in the front row, his usual stern expression in place. Ludacris could feel the older professor's gaze burning into him. This was the moment of truth. He took a deep breath, collected his thoughts, and began. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Ludacris, and today, I'll be presenting a theory that challenges the very foundation of what we know about mathematical systems." The words came out stronger than he expected. He could feel the weight of the room, the silent judgment, but he pressed forward. This theory began with a simple question, one that, for years, no one had been able to answer. What if there was a way to approach this problem from a completely new angle? What if the very principles we thought were unshakable were, in fact, the very things holding us back? As he spoke, Ludacris felt the tension in his body begin to release. He had rehearsed these lines 1,000 times, but now that he was speaking them for real, they felt more powerful, more personal. This wasn't just a theory, it was his life's work, his passion. And he had something to prove. The presentation flowed smoothly as Ludacris walked the audience through the intricacies of his theory, explaining the logic and mathematical principles that had led him to his conclusions. He showed them the data, the tests, and the predictions that his work had generated, and he watched as the audience began to respond. He could see the subtle nods of approval from some, the skepticism from others. But he kept his eyes focused on the task at hand. This was the moment he had worked toward for years. Then, it happened. As Ludacris presented a particularly complicated equation, a voice cut through the room. "Excuse me, Ludacris," Dr. Ford's voice boomed. "I must stop you there. This part of your presentation, it doesn't add up." The entire room went silent. Ludacris's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as he tried to maintain his composure. Dr. Ford's words were sharp, challenging. There was no way to ignore them now. Everyone was waiting for his response. Ludacris took a deep breath and addressed Dr. Ford, the tension between them palpable. "I disagree, Professor. I've checked and rechecked these results. I've tested them against multiple scenarios. The math is sound." Dr. Ford raised an eyebrow, his expression as skeptical as ever. "I'm afraid that's not enough, Ludacris. You've overlooked a key variable, one that renders your entire hypothesis invalid." Ludacris paused. The room was still, the silence suffocating. His mind raced as he tried to pinpoint the flaw Dr. Ford was referring to. Was there something he had missed? Had he really overlooked something so critical? Then, just as the doubt began to creep in, a thought struck him. No, he hadn't missed anything. He hadn't overlooked a variable. In fact, the variable Dr. Ford was referring to was the very reason why the traditional approach hadn't worked. Ludacris's heart raced as he turned back to the whiteboard, writing a new equation. "The variable you're referring to," Ludacris said, his voice steady, "is not a flaw. It's the very key to unlocking the solution." He turned to face the audience, his voice rising with conviction. "What I've done is accounted for this variable in a way that hasn't been considered before. This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for." Ludacris could see the shock on the faces of the audience members. Some were leaning forward, intrigued. Others still looked skeptical, but there was a shift in the room. For the first time, Ludacris felt as though he wasn't just fighting for recognition, he was fighting for the truth. The next few minutes were a blur of equations, clarifications, and tense exchanges. But as Ludacris worked through the problem with a newfound confidence, something incredible happened. Dr. Ford's stern expression began to soften. The older professor was no longer dismissing Ludacris's work outright. Instead, he was listening, reconsidering. Finally, when the last equation was written, Ludacris stepped back, sweat beading on his forehead. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, Dr. Ford spoke. "I see," he said slowly, his voice less certain now. I think you found something." A wave of relief washed over Ludacris. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it felt like he was winning. This was it. This was the turning point. The tension in the room hung thick, as if time itself had paused to witness Ludacris's triumph. The shift in Dr. Ford's expression had not gone unnoticed. The once skeptical professor, who had spent weeks dismantling Ludacris's work, was now reconsidering his position. For Ludacris, it felt like a moment of vindication, a validation of the long hours, the sleepless nights, and the moments of self-doubt. But even as he basked in the quiet acknowledgement of his breakthrough, Ludacris knew that this was only the beginning. This was the turning point, but the road ahead was still long and fraught with obstacles. The academic world would not embrace his theory overnight. It would take time to prove that he was right, to demonstrate that his approach could shift the very foundations of their understanding. The symposium had ended with a sense of awe from many in the audience. Ludacris had presented his work with conviction, and the crowd had responded with a mixture of skepticism, intrigue, and admiration. But as he walked off the stage, a sense of accomplishment settled in his chest. He had done it. He had stood up to the harshest critics and, at least for the moment, come out on top. But as he made his way out of the lecture hall, he spotted Dr. Ford waiting for him near the door. The professor's eyes were no longer filled with dismissal, but instead something more akin to respect, or perhaps, begrudging acceptance. "Ludacris," Dr. Ford called out, his voice softer than before. "Can we talk?" Ludacris hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect. After all, this was the same man who had dismissed his theory as unsolvable just weeks ago. But there was something in Ford's tone that suggested this conversation could be different. "Sure," Ludacris replied, walking over to where the professor stood. Dr. Ford glanced around the hallway, as if ensuring no one was listening, before speaking again. "I won't lie, I had my doubts," he began, his voice tinged with something that might have been admiration. "But the more I think about it, the more I realize you were right to challenge the conventional understanding. What you've done here, it's not just a breakthrough. It's a redefinition of how we approach problems in this field." Ludacris felt a swell of pride, but he kept his composure. "Thank you, Professor," he said simply, but the words carried a weight he hadn't fully expected. Ford's eyes flickered with something like acknowledgement before he continued. "That said, you can't expect the rest of the academic community to just embrace this. You've got your work cut out for you, Ludacris. There will be those who will try to discredit you, to undermine everything you've done. But what you've done, what you've shown, is powerful. Just, be ready for the fight ahead." Ludacris nodded, the reality of the situation setting in. This was only the beginning. Dr. Ford's approval, while significant, wasn't going to be enough to convince the world. There were going to be many who wouldn't accept the validity of his work, and the battles would continue. But in that moment, Ludacris realized something crucial: he wasn't alone in this fight anymore. He had proven to himself, and to others, that his theory was worth believing in. "Thanks for the advice, Professor," Ludacris said. "I'll be ready." Ford gave him a curt nod. "Good. Don't forget, your work has the potential to change everything. But change isn't easy. It takes persistence. You've got that in you. Just make sure you don't lose sight of it when things get tough." With that, Dr. Ford turned and walked away, leaving Ludacris standing in the hallway, his thoughts racing. The weight of Ford's words lingered, but so did the thrill of validation. For a long time, Ludacris had been haunted by the idea that he might be wrong, that his theory was just a pipe dream. But now, he knew better. He had something real, something that could change the course of his field. He had earned his place in the conversation. As Ludacris made his way back to his apartment, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Tamara. "You did it. I knew you could. Let's talk when you get back. You're about to change the world." Ludacris smiled as he typed a quick response. "Thanks, Tamara. Couldn't have done it without you. Let's meet up soon." When he arrived at his apartment, Ludacris found himself pacing again, his mind already racing with the next steps. Tamara's words reminded him of what lay ahead, a long, challenging road. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Ludacris didn't feel alone. He had allies now, people who believed in him, people who were ready to stand by his side as he faced the academic world. And as he sat down to review his notes, to refine his work, a sense of resolve washed over him. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore. This was about rewriting the rules, about showing the world that even someone like him, a kid from a neighborhood where opportunities were limited, could change the course of history. The battle was far from over, but Ludacris was no longer fighting on his own. He had the tools, the knowledge, and the support to make his theory a reality. And that was enough to push him forward. The weeks following the symposium saw Ludacris's work gaining traction. The discussions about his theory were slowly spreading through the academic community. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were still plenty of skeptics who dismissed his ideas outright. But the momentum was building, and more researchers began to look at his work with renewed interest. One day, as he sat at his desk in the university's research lab, his phone buzzed once again. It was an email from a major academic journal. The subject line read, "Your paper, invitation to publish." Ludacris's heart skipped a beat as he opened the email. It was an official invitation from one of the most respected journals in the field, asking him to submit his work for publication. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This was the validation he had longed for. It wasn't just a win for him, it was a win for everyone who had ever been told their ideas weren't good enough, that they didn't belong in certain spaces. It was a triumph for those who dared to challenge the status quo. Ludacris leaned back in his chair, a smile slowly spreading across his face. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like he was on the right path. And he was ready for whatever came next. Ludacris stared at the email in disbelief, the words blurring as his mind struggled to comprehend the enormity of what had just happened. Your paper, invitation to publish. It wasn't just an invitation, it was an endorsement. An academic journal, one of the top publications in the field, wanted to publish his work. For a moment, he felt weightless, as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. The culmination of years of hard work, the sleepless nights, the doubts, and the battles against those who had told him his theory was impossible, this was the recognition he had longed for. It wasn't just validation, it was a sign that he had broken through. But as quickly as the feeling of triumph settled in, a new wave of anxiety crept up. Ludacris had been offered this chance because of his breakthrough, but that didn't mean it would be smooth sailing from here. The process of getting published was notoriously difficult, even for the most brilliant minds. He would have to go through rigorous peer review, and there were sure to be critics, some of whom would do everything in their power to discredit his work. He had to prove himself again, but this time on an even larger stage. Ludacris leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The gravity of what was at stake settled over him. This wasn't just about a personal victory anymore. It was about changing the landscape of his field. It was about showing the world that someone who came from nothing, someone like him, could reshape the boundaries of knowledge. After a few moments, Ludacris took a deep breath and hit reply. Thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to submitting my final manuscript for consideration. He clicked send and sat back, the excitement of the moment quickly turning into a focused determination. This was just the beginning. The path ahead was going to be grueling, but he had already proven that he could stand up to the toughest challenges. The question now was how far he was willing to go to see this through. The next few days passed in a blur. Ludacris worked tirelessly on refining his paper, making sure every equation, every explanation, was airtight. He couldn't afford any mistakes now. The stakes were too high, and the pressure, though daunting, was something he welcomed. He had a point to prove, not just to the academic world, but to himself. In the meantime, the academic community's reaction to his work began to take shape. The early response was mixed, as expected. There were some who praised the originality of his theory, acknowledging its potential to bring about a paradigm shift. Others were more cautious, questioning the underlying assumptions and the application of his methods. Some, like Dr. Ford, had come around to see his approach as legitimate, but there were still plenty of critics who insisted that it couldn't hold up under scrutiny. One of the more vocal critics was Dr. Lawrence Grayson, a professor known for his traditionalist views and his tendency to dismiss anything that didn't fit neatly into the established framework. He had written a lengthy critique of Ludacris's paper, outlining various alleged flaws and inconsistencies. Ludacris had read the critique with a mixture of irritation and curiosity, but he knew that Dr. Grayson's attack wasn't personal. It was about defending the old ways, about preserving the status quo. But Ludacris wasn't about to back down. He spent the next few days combing through Dr. Grayson's points, addressing each one with precision and clarity. There were gaps in Grayson's argument, holes in his logic that Ludacris was quick to point out. By the time he was finished, Ludacris had written a detailed rebuttal, a point-by-point analysis that not only defended his theory but also advanced it further. When he sent it off, he felt a sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about winning arguments. It was about pushing the boundaries of knowledge. And Ludacris was determined to be part of that change. The peer review process took several months, and during that time, Ludacris continued to refine his theory. He worked alongside Tamara, who had been a constant source of support. They spent countless hours together, discussing the nuances of the theory, testing new applications, and challenging each other's ideas. Their partnership had grown stronger, and Ludacris began to rely on Tamara's insight more and more. Her unique perspective, her ability to think outside the box, was invaluable. It was clear to him that she wasn't just an academic colleague, she had become a friend, someone whose opinions he trusted implicitly. And then, one afternoon, the phone call came. It was from the editor of the journal that had invited him to submit his work. Ludacris, the editor's voice was warm but professional. "I'm pleased to inform you that after thorough review, your paper has been accepted for publication. Congratulations." Ludacris felt his heart race. This was the moment he had worked for, the moment that validated everything he had fought for. His breakthrough wasn't just a theory anymore, it was being recognized by the very institution that had once dismissed him. "I appreciate the opportunity," Ludacris said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for believing in my work. We look forward to seeing your research in print," the editor replied. "We believe this is a significant contribution to the field." The call ended, and for a moment, Ludacris sat in stunned silence. His mind raced as the enormity of what had just happened sank in. He had done it. His theory was going to be published, and it was going to change the way people thought about mathematics. He reached for his phone, eager to share the news. "It's official. They accepted the paper. We did it." He hit send, then sat back, allowing himself a moment to revel in the success. But even as he did, he knew that the real work had only just begun. Publication in one of the top journals was a huge achievement, but it was also a challenge. His work was now out in the open, ready to be critiqued, analyzed, and scrutinized by the global academic community. But Ludacris wasn't afraid. He had already faced the toughest challenges. He had been told his theory was impossible, that he was just another dreamer. Now, he had proven them wrong. His work was real, and it was going to leave a mark on the world. As Ludacris walked over to the window of his apartment and looked out at the bustling streets below, he realized something important: the journey he had started was never just about mathematics. It was about breaking down barriers, about proving that anyone, no matter where they came from, no matter the obstacles in their path, could achieve greatness. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there were more battles to fight, but for the first time, Ludacris saw the horizon with clarity. And it was a horizon full of possibility. Ludacris woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. As he groggily reached for it, his eyes scanned the screen to find an array of messages and notifications flooding in. The news of his paper's acceptance had spread like wildfire, and suddenly, everyone, from his professors to his old high school classmates, had something to say. Some messages were filled with excitement, congratulating him on this monumental achievement. Others, however, were more wary, filled with cautious praise and veiled skepticism. Ludacris had anticipated this, but seeing it all unfold in real time made the weight of his accomplishment feel heavier. One message caught his eye, though, a message from Dr. Grayson. "Congratulations, Ludacris. I see you've finally gotten the academic community's attention. But I stand by my critique. The real work begins now. I trust you're prepared for the consequences of pushing the boundaries. I hope you're ready for what's next. The words were sharp, almost biting. Dr. Grayson had always been the embodiment of the old guard in academia, someone who believed that innovation needed to be filtered through strict traditionalism. To him, Ludacris was still an outsider, a young upstart challenging the foundation of decades, no, centuries, of academic thought. Ludacris put down his phone and exhaled slowly. He had expected this. But it didn't make it any easier to swallow. The road to acceptance was never linear, and the higher he rose, the more enemies he was bound to make. He knew that Grayson's words weren't just about him, they were about maintaining control. The stakes were no longer about whether his theory could be proved, it was about how the academic world would respond to the possibility of change. Let them come, Ludacris muttered to himself, his jaw tightening. He had come too far to let one critic sway him now. He wasn't just going to let the doors open for others like him, he was going to kick them open himself. The following weeks were a blur of activity. Ludacris worked diligently on the final revisions of his manuscript, incorporating feedback from various colleagues, including Tamara, who was becoming more and more involved in the process. He valued her insights, which balanced his own tendencies toward ambitious, bold moves with a grounded, practical approach. Tamara had been his anchor throughout this journey, and he couldn't help but think that the success of his theory was just as much hers as it was his. However, as his work gained momentum, so did the criticism. Dr. Grayson was not the only one who had reservations. Several prominent figures in the field had issued rebuttals in journals and at conferences, some suggesting that Ludacris had overstepped, while others questioned the broader applicability of his theory. One evening, as Ludacris sat in his dimly lit apartment, reviewing a particularly scathing critique from a rival professor, he began to feel the weight of the battle ahead. Was this really what he had signed up for? Was it worth it to continue pressing forward, knowing that the academic world would likely continue to oppose him? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Hey, you in there?" Tamara's voice was muffled but clear. She had been a constant presence in his life over the past few months, offering both emotional and intellectual support. Ludacris stood up to open the door, and when Tamara stepped inside, he could see the concern in her eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, sitting down across from him. "What's going on?" Ludacris rubbed his eyes, the weight of the situation becoming more apparent with every passing minute. It's hard, Tamara. All this attention, the scrutiny, the criticism. They say that it's part of the process, but I don't know anymore. I just feel like I'm up against an entire system. And I'm not sure I'm strong enough to fight it. Tamara didn't immediately respond. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on his. "Look," she began, her tone serious but calm. "You've always known this wouldn't be easy. But this is bigger than just you now. You've cracked something no one thought could be cracked, and people are scared. They don't want things to change because it forces them to re-examine everything they thought they knew." Ludacris met her gaze. "But what if I'm wrong? What if everything I've worked for doesn't actually hold up? What if, in the end, this was just some impossible dream I had?" Tamara smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to calm him instantly. "Then you fail. And you learn. But you don't stop. You're not the first person to be told that what they're doing can't be done. Look at all the people who've come before you, the ones who broke down barriers, Einstein, Newton, even someone as simple as Thomas Edison. They faced critics too. What made them legends wasn't that they were always right. It was that they didn't stop trying when the world told them no." Ludacris felt a flicker of hope. Tamara was right. He couldn't let the noise and the resistance drown out his conviction. He had come too far to give up now. He had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and made too many sacrifices to let one moment of doubt stop him. "So what do we do now?" he asked, a hint of resolve returning to his voice. Tamara grinned. Now. Now we keep moving forward. We refine your work. We continue to engage with the critiques. We show them that you can't be dismissed. We get this published, and we let the world see what you've done. Ludacris nodded, feeling the familiar spark of determination reignite within him. It was time to fight back, not with anger or defiance, but with clarity, with evidence, and with an unwavering belief in his work. The next several weeks were a blur of action. Ludacris tirelessly revised his manuscript, addressing every critique, every challenge, with the precision of a seasoned scientist. He knew the academic world wouldn't be easily swayed, but that wasn't his problem. His problem was ensuring that his theory was sound and irrefutable. During this time, Tamara proved to be an invaluable ally. They worked side by side, refining their arguments and pushing each other to be better. As their bond grew stronger, Ludacris couldn't help but feel that this journey was as much about the people in his life as it was about the work itself. But he knew that no matter how many revisions they made, the battle would continue. The acceptance of his theory, the transformation of his ideas into something tangible, would require more than just approval, it would require recognition, respect, and most importantly, change. And Ludacris was prepared to see it through, no matter the cost. By the time the final revisions were submitted, Ludacris felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had given it everything he had. Now, all he could do was wait. But in that waiting, he knew one thing for certain, his legacy was being forged in real time. Whether or not the academic community embraced him, Ludacris had already succeeded. He had shown the world that even the most impossible ideas could be made real, if you dared to believe in them. And that belief, in the end, was what would carry him forward. Ludacris stood by the window, looking out over the city skyline. The setting sun bathed everything in a golden light, but it did little to ease the storm raging in his mind. It had been weeks since he'd submitted the final revisions to his paper, and although there were moments of peace, like when he and Tamara would sit together, talking through the finer points of the theory, those moments were rare. His thoughts kept returning to the one big question, what if I'm not ready? The waiting had become unbearable. His phone buzzed on the table behind him, snapping him out of his reverie. He turned and walked over to grab it, noticing immediately that it was a message from the editor of the prestigious journal that had agreed to publish his work. His pulse quickened, and without thinking, he swiped the screen open. Ludacris, we need to speak with you regarding your submission. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Ludacris stared at the message for a moment, his mind spinning. This was it. This was the call he had been dreading. He knew the academic world well enough to understand that the most important, and often most stressful, conversations occurred after a manuscript was accepted for peer review. It could be an endorsement, a request for clarification, or, worst of all, a rejection. His fingers hovered over the screen. Should I call right away, or wait? Tamara's voice cut through the silence. You're staring at that thing like it's about to bite you. Call them. Ludacris turned to see her standing in the doorway, arms crossed, her face showing concern but also a hint of a smile. He swallowed hard, the nerves creeping in. I don't know. What if they didn't like it? What if this is the end of the line? Tamara walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. If this is the end of the line, you've already shown the world that you're capable of something no one thought possible. Don't forget that. Her words settled over him like a warm blanket. He nodded, taking in a deep breath. Tamara was right. He had already pushed the boundaries in ways no one expected. Whatever happened, this was a victory in itself. Ludacris dialed the number and waited as the phone rang. The line clicked, and the editor's voice came through. Ludacris, this is Sarah Miller from the Journal of Advanced Mathematics. How are you? I'm doing well, thank you for asking, he replied, his voice steady but betraying a slight tension. I got your message. I'm hoping this is a good sign. There was a short pause before Sarah spoke again. I'm calling because after the peer review process, we've come to a decision. Your paper is, well, it's one of the most innovative pieces of work we've seen in years. But it's also very controversial. Ludacris's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the familiar tension in his chest, like something heavy pressing on him. Controversial, he repeated, trying to keep his voice calm. Yes, controversial in the best sense, Sarah clarified. The reviewers are split, but there is a great deal of excitement about the potential of your theory. However, we believe it's crucial that we bring you in for a final round of discussions. We want to understand your methodology better, especially the parts that challenge existing paradigms so fundamentally. Ludacris felt his shoulders relax. He had expected rejection or harsh criticism, but this was a different kind of challenge, one that could push his theory into new, uncharted waters. That's great to hear, he replied, though his mind was already racing ahead, thinking about the meeting that would follow. I'm ready to discuss anything. When would be a good time? We can schedule a meeting for next week. Our editorial team and a few select reviewers would like to have a video conference with you, Sarah said. You'll be able to address any concerns and answer questions directly. After that, we'll finalize everything. Thank you, Sarah. I'll be there. As the call ended, Ludacris let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His mind swirled with possibilities. This wasn't just an academic meeting, it was a pivotal moment. The academic community was on the edge of something huge, and now, it was his chance to either solidify his place or risk falling short. The pressure was mounting, but so was his resolve. Tamara, who had been silently watching the conversation unfold, gave him a grin as he set the phone down. I take it that wasn't a rejection. No, it was, they're excited, but they have some reservations. They want to meet next week, get into the nitty-gritty details. This is it, Tamara. This is the big one. She nodded, her face full of understanding. You've got this, Ludacris. Don't let the pressure get to you. You've done the hard part already. Now, it's just about showing them why your theory matters. Her words were simple but powerful. Ludacris had come so far, and it was hard not to feel the weight of everything riding on this one final moment. But deep inside, he knew Tamara was right. This was just one more hurdle, one he had already overcome in his mind 1,000 times over. The days leading up to the meeting were a blur of activity. Ludacris spent hours preparing, refining his arguments, reviewing every possible question the editorial board might ask. He and Tamara spent late nights poring over the finer details of his work. They revisited equations, explored alternative explanations, and even practiced the kinds of questions they might face. Ludacris couldn't afford to stumble, not now. The night before the meeting, Tamara looked at him as they finished up one last round of revisions. You've got all the answers, she said quietly. Tomorrow, just let the work speak for itself. Ludacris smiled, though there was a weight in his chest. I've never felt more ready for anything in my life. The next day, when the time finally came, Ludacris sat at his desk, laptop open and camera set just right. He took a deep breath, adjusting his collar and making sure his notes were neatly organized. The video conference call began, and one by one, the faces of the editorial team and peer reviewers filled the screen. As the conversation started, Ludacris's nerves settled. He was no longer just a student from a small town, he was a researcher, a mathematician who had accomplished something extraordinary. The questions came, but he answered them confidently, addressing each concern with clarity and precision. The more he spoke, the more he felt the weight of the room shift. It was clear that his ideas, though controversial, were being taken seriously. By the end of the call, the tension had dissolved into a mutual respect. Sarah Miller, the editor, spoke last. Ludacris, we're impressed. This is groundbreaking work. We'll be in touch with the final steps, but I believe we're on track for publication. As the call ended, Ludacris sat back, a smile creeping across his face. I did it, he thought, and for the first time in a long while, it wasn't just about the victory. It was about knowing that the world was finally listening. It was his theory, his legacy. And nothing was going to stop him now. As the week passed, Ludacris's mind buzzed with the realization that the world was on the brink of something monumental. The publication was just around the corner, and with it, the potential to forever change the field of mathematics. And yet, even as excitement surged through him, Ludacris couldn't help but wonder what lay beyond that moment. There were still mountains to climb, questions to answer, and the ever-present challenge of proving himself time and time again. But he was ready. He had always been ready. This was only the beginning. Ludacris sat in his office late that evening, staring at the dimly lit screen in front of him. He had just received confirmation that his paper would be published in the Journal of Advanced Mathematics next month. It was happening, the moment he had worked for was finally within his grasp. The exhilaration should have been overwhelming, but instead, it was tempered with a strange, nagging feeling that he couldn't quite shake. The room was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the edge of his desk. For weeks, he had been immersed in the revisions, the interviews, the phone calls with peers and editors, each step pushing him closer to his goal. But now, as the reality of it settled in, a thought lingered in the back of his mind: what comes next? He glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Tomorrow would likely be asleep, but they had promised to meet the next day to celebrate the success. They had both been through so much together, and this moment belonged to both of them. But that didn't stop the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. What if the academic world doesn't embrace this the way I hope? What if they tear it apart, piece by piece? These fears had been there from the very beginning, but now, they felt more real than ever. He had shattered a foundational belief in mathematics. People would fight back. He knew that. The ringing of his phone broke his train of thought. He grabbed it quickly, seeing Tamara's name flash on the screen. He hadn't expected her to call this late. "Hey," Ludacris answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "You okay?" Tamara's voice was warm, but there was an undercurrent of concern in it. "You've been quiet for a while." Ludacris leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, I don't know. It's all happening so fast, you know. The paper's going to be published next month. It's like I can't catch my breath. I thought I'd feel more triumphant, but instead, I feel like I'm about to face something bigger." Tamara was silent for a moment before speaking with calm reassurance. "It's normal to feel that way. You've been pushing yourself so hard to get to this point, and now that it's actually happening, it can feel like the ground is shifting beneath you. But you've earned this, Ludacris. You've already done something that no one thought was possible. The rest? It's just the next chapter." He sighed, his mind still clouded by uncertainty. "I just keep wondering if people will get it. If they'll understand the importance of what I've done. Or if they'll tear it down before it even has a chance to change things." Tamara's voice softened, and Ludacris could practically feel her standing there beside him, grounding him. "You don't get to decide how they'll react. But you do get to decide what you're going to do next. You've already proven the value of your work. Now, let it speak for itself." He could hear the confidence in her words, and for the first time in a while, he allowed himself to believe them. "Thanks, Tamara," he said quietly. "I needed to hear that." "Of course. Now get some rest, okay? Tomorrow we celebrate. No more thinking about what comes next for at least one night." Ludacris smiled faintly, appreciating her words more than he could express. "I'll try. Talk to you tomorrow." As he hung up, he sat for a moment, the silence enveloping him. Tamara was right. There would always be the unknown, always be the looming shadow of doubt. But right now, he had earned this moment. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The next day, Ludacris and Tamara met at a small cafe near the university, a place they frequented for quiet, informal meetings. The buzz of the city outside contrasted sharply with the calm, intimate atmosphere of the café, and Ludacris found himself easing into the moment, his mind at least momentarily freed from the constant mental calculations. "So," Tamara said, after they had ordered their drinks, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Now that the paper's going to be published, what's next for you? Do you have a plan? More research? More theories?" Ludacris took a long sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth as it settled in his chest. He'd been thinking about that question all morning, but he didn't have a solid answer. The truth was, part of him had been so focused on proving the theory that he hadn't considered the next step. What did he do once the breakthrough had been made? What happened when you were no longer fighting for recognition, but for lasting impact? "I guess I'll have to see where this takes me," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "I've always thought of myself as someone who challenges what we think we know. This is just the beginning, but I'm starting to realize that there are still a lot of questions left unanswered. I don't want to just be remembered for one paper. I want to change the way we think about everything." Tamara smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I think you already have. You've shown people what's possible. That's a huge step." Ludacris nodded slowly. He didn't know where his path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace in the uncertainty. The work he had done wasn't just about one paper, one idea, or one breakthrough. It was about the shift he had ignited, a shift that would open doors for others to follow in his footsteps. As the days passed, Ludacris dove into his next challenge, the aftermath of the publication. He'd heard rumblings from peers who were skeptical of his work, and now, it was time to brace himself for what was to come. Even though the work had been accepted, the real test was always going to be how the world reacted once it hit the public eye. And then it came, the first round of critiques. The day the journal was released, Ludacris was bombarded with emails, phone calls, and social media posts. At first, it was what he had expected, praise mixed with skepticism. But soon, the messages started to shift. The academic world was divided. Some hailed his theory as revolutionary, while others tore it apart with pointed criticisms. The media, ever hungry for drama, seized upon the divide, portraying the controversy as a battle between old and new paradigms. One afternoon, Ludacris sat at his desk, scrolling through the barrage of responses. His eyes landed on a post from Dr. Grayson, the professor who had once critiqued his work so harshly. A theory based on an error of reasoning. Ludacris may have uncovered something new, but he has done so at the cost of established logic. The claims presented in this paper are, at best, a step backward for mathematics. It was harsh, brutal, even. But Ludacris felt a strange sense of calm as he read the words. This was the challenge he had expected. He wasn't done yet. The path to lasting recognition wasn't paved with easy victories, but with resilience in the face of doubt. He smiled to himself, feeling the weight of the road ahead but also the resolve to walk it. This was his moment, and he would face whatever came next with everything he had. As Ludacris prepared to address the critics and defend his work, he knew there was more at stake than his reputation. This was about reshaping how the world saw mathematics, and about proving that anyone, from any background, could break barriers if they dared to challenge the impossible. And in that, he had already won. Ludacris paced back and forth in his small, cluttered office, his thoughts spinning. The wave of attention that had followed the publication of his groundbreaking paper had grown, but it wasn't all the positive buzz he had hoped for. His phone had been ringing non-stop, with calls from journalists, academics, and critics, each demanding his time and perspective. Some hailed him as a genius, others accused him of academic irresponsibility. The divide was stark. As much as he had prepared for the public scrutiny, nothing could have prepared him for the emotional toll. Every critique felt like a personal attack, even if the reviewers didn't know him or his story. He had always known that challenging the status quo would invite resistance, but the venom in some of the feedback still stung. The harshest comments had come from Dr. Grayson, the professor whose scorn had once been a driving force behind Ludacris's determination. Now, as Ludacris read through the latest scathing remarks from Grayson's academic circle, a feeling of déjà vu washed over him. It was as if he were back at square one, fighting the same battle all over again. One particularly cutting email from Dr. Grayson's colleague, Professor Lisa Green, stood out. The message was direct and dismissive. While Ludacris's paper presents a fresh perspective, it is built on a flawed foundation. Mathematics is not a playground for wishful thinking. His approach undermines decades of established theory, and we cannot afford to embrace ideas that do not stand up to scrutiny. It's time for him to reconsider his approach before he does irreparable damage to his career. Ludacris sat back, the weight of the words pressing down on him. It felt like an uphill battle he couldn't win. The academic world he had entered was a battlefield, and the war was just beginning. He pulled his laptop closer, taking a deep breath as he opened his email inbox. More critiques awaited him. Some were civil, pointing out gaps in his work, others were downright hostile, dismissing his ideas outright. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he considered his next move. He could respond, try to engage in a back and forth with the critics, or he could retreat, concede that the academic world wasn't ready for his work. But then, he thought about all the moments that had led him here. He thought about the nights spent hunched over equations, the struggle to prove his theory in the face of relentless doubt. He thought about Tamara, who had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. I can't give up now, he thought. Not when I've come so far. He closed his inbox and made a decision. If he was going to be a part of this conversation, he would do it on his terms. It wasn't enough to just present his theory. He needed to defend it, clarify it, and show the world why it mattered. He was going to face his critics head-on. The following day, Ludacris arranged a meeting with several key figures in the mathematical community who had expressed interest in his work. Among them were some respected professors who had been open-minded, willing to engage in thoughtful dialogue rather than quick judgment. Ludacris knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to present his case, to turn the criticism into an opportunity for growth. He arrived early at the university's conference room, heart pounding. As he set up his presentation, he reviewed his notes one more time. He had come prepared, not just with answers, but with questions. Questions about the limits of established theory. Questions about the future of mathematics. This wasn't just about defending his paper, it was about changing the conversation. The room slowly filled with academics. There was a hushed murmur as Ludacris took his place at the front, his laptop poised and ready. He scanned the room, noting familiar faces, some friendly, others more skeptical. But one face stood out, Dr. Grayson. He had arrived late, his arms folded across his chest, his expression unreadable. Ludacris's throat went dry, but he refused to let the sight of his former professor intimidate him. This was his moment. He had spent his entire life preparing for this, and now it was time to prove it. The presentation began, and Ludacris spoke with a newfound confidence. He walked through his theory step by step, showing the foundational principles, the thought process that had led him to challenge the established norms, and the evidence he had gathered to back up his claims. As he spoke, he could feel the tension in the room. Some attendees leaned forward, intrigued by his ideas. Others were still skeptical, their expressions hard to read. But Ludacris pressed on, answering questions as they arose, never backing down from his convictions. He understood that the academic world was built on debate, it was how progress was made. And if he was going to be a part of that process, he had to embrace the challenge. Eventually, it came time for Dr. Grayson to speak. The older professor leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he spoke in his typical, measured tone. Ludacris, he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, I've read your paper in depth. While there are certainly novel ideas here, I must point out that your conclusions are based on a set of assumptions that contradict well-established laws. If we are to accept your work, we must first address the core flaw in your reasoning. Ludacris's stomach tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had anticipated this moment. "I appreciate your critique, Dr. Grayson," Ludacris said, his voice steady, "but I'd like to challenge the assumption you're presenting. The very laws you refer to were built on assumptions themselves, assumptions that, if you look closely, are based on principles that no longer hold true in the context I've outlined." There was a collective gasp in the room. Ludacris felt a rush of adrenaline as he continued, making his case for the future of mathematics. The need to evolve, to question, and to embrace the unknown. The back and forth that followed was intense. Dr. Grayson wasn't one to back down easily, but Ludacris held his ground. It was a battle of wills, of ideas, but Ludacris could feel something shift in the room. His critics were listening. They weren't just dismissing him out of hand anymore. They were engaging with his theory, testing it, probing its weaknesses. And Ludacris knew this was the first step toward true acceptance. When the meeting finally adjourned, Ludacris stood, drenched in sweat but exhilarated. He had done it. He had stood up for his work, and while the battle wasn't over, it felt like he had earned the respect of the academic world in a way that would shape the rest of his career. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Ludacris's theory continued to spark debate, with some embracing it wholeheartedly while others remained steadfast in their criticism. But one thing was clear: his work had irrevocably shifted the conversation in the field of mathematics. Tamara, ever by his side, had watched the entire process unfold with admiration. "You did it," she said one night, as they sat together after another long day. "You stood your ground, and now people can't ignore you." Ludacris smiled, though there was a depth of emotion behind his eyes. "I didn't just do this for me. I did it for everyone who's ever been told their ideas don't matter, that they don't belong. This is bigger than one person. It's about breaking barriers. For all of us." As Ludacris reflected on the journey that had brought him here, he realized something profound: success wasn't just about being right. It was about having the courage to question everything, even when the world told you to stop. And now, he had the chance to redefine the future of mathematics. But more than that, he had proven that no matter where you came from, no matter who you were, if you had the vision and the perseverance, you could change the world. And in that, Ludacris had already won. The battle was far from over, but Ludacris was ready. He had faced the critics, stood up to the giants of academia, and emerged stronger. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was one he was now confident enough to walk. He had proven that, no matter the odds, the pursuit of knowledge and truth was worth every fight. And this was just the beginning. Months passed, and the world of academia slowly began to change. Ludacris's paper had become a pivotal point of discussion, not only in the mathematical community but also in the public eye. What had begun as a storm of skepticism and fierce debate had evolved into something far more profound, a reckoning of sorts. Scholars were now revisiting their own long-held assumptions, questioning what had once been deemed unassailable truths. But it was far from smooth sailing for Ludacris. Despite the growing interest in his work, he continued to face pushback from those who believed his theories were a dangerous disruption to the very fabric of mathematics. Some tried to discredit him, but their efforts only seemed to fuel the conversation. For every critic, there were two who found his ideas revolutionary. He had become a symbol of intellectual rebellion, a figure who embodied the power of perseverance and the drive to challenge convention. Ludacris sat in his office late one evening, looking out the window at the city skyline. The world felt different now. More vast. More uncertain. It was as if the universe had opened up to him, inviting him to explore its uncharted mysteries. Yet, despite all the recognition and acclaim, Ludacris couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was still searching for something more, something deeper. It was as if the real journey was just beginning. Tamara's voice interrupted his thoughts as she knocked on the door and entered the room. She was smiling, holding a small envelope in her hand. "Got something for you," she said, sitting down across from him. Ludacris raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Tamara handed him the envelope. "It's an invitation. They're offering you a position, at the Institute of Advanced Mathematics in Boston. Ludacris took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the paper. Inside was an official letter, inviting him to join their prestigious research team. It was everything he had dreamed of, a chance to work alongside the brightest minds in the world, to push the boundaries of his theory even further. For a moment, he stared at the letter, overwhelmed by the magnitude of it. But then, the weight of the journey he had been on, the years of sacrifice, the battles he had fought, the doubts he had overcome, settled on him. "I don't know," he said quietly, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Is this really what I want? To go back into that world?" Tamara regarded him thoughtfully. "What do you mean? You fought for this your whole life. This is your opportunity to shape the future of mathematics." Ludacris nodded, but a part of him remained unsure. The last few months had been a whirlwind of success and scrutiny, but in the quiet moments, when the noise of the world faded away, Ludacris found himself questioning his purpose. Was it enough to make a mark in the field? To be remembered as the one who changed the course of mathematics? Or was there something more he was meant to do? "I've spent so much time trying to prove myself," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But now I'm wondering if I've been chasing the wrong things. Maybe I've been looking for validation instead of meaning." Tamara smiled softly. "You've done more than prove yourself. You've changed the way people think. And the world isn't just about accomplishments. It's about what you choose to do with your success. Maybe you don't need the spotlight anymore. Maybe you can focus on the impact, on helping others, on passing the torch to the next generation." Ludacris looked at her, seeing the truth in her words. It wasn't about the recognition or the accolades. It was about the legacy he would leave behind, the knowledge he would pass on, the doors he would open for others like him, who had once been overlooked. "I think you're right," he said, finally feeling a sense of clarity. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about what I can give back. What I can inspire." Ludacris took the offer from the Institute of Advanced Mathematics, but with a new perspective. He wasn't going there to prove anything to anyone. He was going to contribute, to learn, to teach, and to inspire. He began mentoring younger mathematicians, encouraging them to think outside the box, to embrace the unknown and challenge the established norms, just as he had done. The knowledge he had gained wasn't just for himself, it was meant to be shared, to shape the future of the field. His days were now filled with collaboration, discussion, and exploration. He was no longer consumed by the need for validation or the pressure to be recognized. Instead, he found fulfillment in the quiet work, in the moments of discovery that occurred when minds came together in pursuit of something greater than individual glory. At night, he would sit with Tamara in their small apartment, talking about the progress they had made, the doors they had opened, and the people they had met along the way. They would discuss the challenges, the setbacks, but always with a sense of optimism. "We're building something," Tamara would say, and Ludacris would agree. It wasn't just his legacy they were creating, it was the legacy of everyone who believed in the power of questioning, the courage to push boundaries, and the importance of perseverance. Years later, Ludacris stood before a crowded auditorium at the Institute, delivering a lecture to a new generation of young mathematicians. His words were no longer about proving his worth or defending his theories. They were about inspiring others to continue the work he had started, to challenge the impossible, to question what was thought to be unchangeable, and to never stop exploring. As he finished his lecture, the room erupted in applause. Ludacris looked out at the eager faces of the students, knowing that the future of mathematics was in good hands. These students, the ones who would carry the torch forward, would build upon the foundation he had laid, just as he had built upon the work of those who came before him. After the lecture, as Ludacris walked through the corridors of the Institute, he was approached by one of his students, a young woman with a look of excitement in her eyes. "Dr. Ludacris," she said, "I've been reading your paper. I think I've found something that could take your theory even further. Could we discuss it sometime?" Ludacris smiled, a deep sense of satisfaction filling him. The work wasn't done, The journey was far from over. There would always be more questions, more challenges, more ideas to explore. But now, he had found his true purpose, not in the recognition or accolades, but in the process of discovery, in passing on the knowledge that could change the world. As he walked into his office, Ludacris felt at peace. He had faced the impossible, broken barriers, and shown the world that anyone, no matter their background, could make a difference. And now, his legacy was not just in the theory he had proved, but in the countless minds he had inspired to keep asking questions, to keep pushing forward. He had found what he was looking for, not in the accolades or fame, but in the quiet fulfillment of knowing that his work had opened doors for others to follow. And that was enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?